Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The chanting started at exactly 3:33 a.m. every single night. That's when we realized our new neighbors weren't quite what they seemed. My wife, Emily, and I had just moved into our first apartment together. It was a cozy two-bedroom in an old converted house. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. We were excited to start this new chapter of our lives, blissfully unaware of the strangeness that awaited us. The first few nights were uneventful. We unpacked, arranged furniture, and slowly settled into our new home. Our neighbors, a middle-aged couple we'd only glimpsed in passing, seemed quiet and kept to themselves. Perfect, we thought. It was on the fourth night that things changed. I woke up suddenly, my heart racing for no apparent reason. The digital clock on our nightstand read 3:33 a.m. As I lay there, trying to calm my inexplicably frayed nerves, I heard it, a low, rhythmic sound coming through the wall we shared with our neighbors. At first, I thought it might be a TV or radio left on, but as I listened more closely, I realized it was voices, multiple voices, speaking in unison, in a language I didn't recognize. The sound was muffled, but there was no mistaking the cadence of chanting. I nudged Emily awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. She listened for a moment, then nodded, her eyes wide in the darkness. "What is that?" "It sounds like chanting." We lay there, listening to the strange sounds for what felt like hours. Just as suddenly as it had started, at exactly 4:44 a.m., the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was almost as unnerving as the chanting had been. The next morning, over coffee, we tried to rationalize what we'd heard. Maybe our neighbors were part of some obscure religion with odd prayer times. Maybe they were practicing for a play or some kind of performance art. We came up with a dozen explanations, each more unlikely than the last. But deep down, we both knew something wasn't right. That night, we decided to stay up and see if it happened again. Sure enough, at 3:33 a.m. on the dot, the chanting began. This time, we pressed our ears to the wall, trying to make out words. The language was like nothing I'd ever heard before, guttural and harsh, with strange rhythms that seemed to defy normal speech patterns. As we listened, I began to feel odd, dizzy almost, with a strange pressure building behind my eyes. Emily must have felt it too, because she suddenly pulled away from the wall, gasping. "Did you feel that?" she asked, her voice shaky. I nodded, unable to find words to describe the sensation. It was as if the chanting was trying to rewrite something in my brain, to change the very way I perceived reality. This continued night after night, always starting at 3:33 a.m., always ending at 4:44 a.m. We tried earplugs, white noise machines, even sleeping in the living room, but nothing could fully block out the sound or the strange effects it had on us. During the day, our neighbors seemed normal enough. We'd see them leaving for work in the morning or bringing in groceries. They'd smile and wave, exchange pleasantries about the weather. But there was something off about their eyes, a blankness that sent chills down my spine. We started noticing other things too. Strange symbols drawn in chalk on the sidewalk outside our building, always washed away by morning. The faint smell of incense and something metallic, blood, lingering in the hallway. And sometimes, late at night, we'd see shadows moving behind their curtained windows. Shadows that didn't quite match human shapes. About 2 weeks into this nightly ritual, things escalated. The chanting grew louder, more frenzied. And then, we heard something else, a sound that still haunts my nightmares. It was a scream, but not a human scream. It was too high-pitched, too alien. That was the breaking point for Emily. "We need to call the police," she said, her face pale in the dim light of our bedroom. I agreed, But as I reached for my phone, a wave of dizziness hit me. The room spun, and for a moment, I could have sworn I saw something moving in the shadows of our room, something that shouldn't exist in our reality. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. By then, of course, the chanting had stopped. Our neighbors answered their door looking perfectly normal, if a bit annoyed at being woken up. They invited the officers in, and after a brief look around, the police left. No signs of any disturbance, they said. Maybe we'd had a bad dream, but we knew what we'd heard, what we'd felt. The next day, we went to the building manager, an older man named Frank. We told him everything, expecting disbelief or dismissal. Instead, he listened with a grave expression. "You're not the first to complain about them," he said finally, "but there's nothing I can do. Their rent always arrives on time, in cash, and technically, they haven't broken any rules." He paused, then leaned in close. "My advice, move out, as soon as you can. Some things are better left alone." We wanted to follow his advice, and we really did. But our lease was ironclad, and we couldn't afford to break it. So we stayed, enduring night after night of that terrible chanting. As the weeks wore on, the effects became more pronounced. We started having nightmares, vivid, horrifying dreams of impossible geometries and vast, dark entities that defied description. We'd wake up with nosebleeds, or find strange symbols carved into our skin that faded by morning. Emily started to change. She became withdrawn, spending hours staring at blank walls, muttering under her breath in that same strange language we heard at night. I wasn't much better. I found myself drawn to odd books in the library, texts on obscure occult practices and eldritch horrors. One night, about 2 months after it all began, I woke up to find Emily gone from our bed. Panicked, I searched the apartment, finally finding her pressed up against the wall we shared with our neighbors. She was chanting along with them, her eyes rolled back in her head, blood trickling from her nose. I tried to pull her away, but she fought me with inhuman strength. As we struggled, I caught a glimpse of something through a crack in the baseboard. An eye, huge, alien, swirling with colors that shouldn't exist. It blinked, and in that moment, I understood. Our neighbors weren't summoning something. They were letting something in. I don't remember much of what happened next. I have flashes of memory, dragging Emily out of the apartment, running downstairs that seemed to stretch and twist impossibly. The sound of something large pursuing us. When I came to my senses, we were in my car, miles away from the city. We never went back to that apartment. We left everything behind, changed our names, moved across the country. But sometimes, I still wake up at 3:33 a.m., my heart racing, sure that I can hear that chanting in the distance. Emily recovered, mostly. She doesn't remember anything from that last night. Sometimes I envy her that. As for me, I can't shake the feeling that we didn't really escape, that whatever was trying to come through is still out there, searching, waiting. So if you ever find yourself with new neighbors who keep to themselves, who chant at odd hours of the night, who make you feel strange just by being near them, don't ignore it. Don't try to rationalize it. Just run. Run as far and as fast as you can. Because some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. The basement door shouldn't have been locked. We owned every inch of this house, or so we thought. When Sarah and I bought the old Victorian on Maple Street, we thought we'd struck gold. A beautiful, spacious home at a price that seemed too good to be true. The real estate agent had gushed about its character and history, but glossed over the fact that it had been on the market for nearly 2 years. We were too excited about our first home to ask why. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of unpacking, painting, and settling in. It wasn't until about a month after moving in that I noticed the door. It was tucked away in a corner of the basement, behind some old shelving units left by the previous owners. At first, I thought it was just a closet or maybe access to the house's ancient plumbing, but when I tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. "Hey, Sarah," I called upstairs. "Do you know anything about a locked door in the basement?" Her footsteps creaked on the floor above, then down the stairs. "What locked door?" she asked, peering around me at the weathered wood. I jiggled the handle again, demonstrating its immobility. "This one. It's not on any of the house plans we got." Sarah frowned, her excitement at a potential secret room quickly replaced by concern. "That's odd. Shouldn't we have keys to everything?" We spent the next hour searching through the jumble of keys the previous owners had left us, but none of them fit the old-fashioned lock. Sarah suggested calling a locksmith, but something held me back. A nagging feeling that maybe this door was locked for a reason. "Let's ask the neighbors first," I said. "Maybe they know something about it." But our neighbors, an elderly couple who'd lived on the street for decades, just shook their heads when we asked. "Never heard of any locked room in that old house," Mr. Johnson said, his rheumy eyes narrowing suspiciously. "Best leave well enough alone, if you ask me." His wife nodded in agreement, adding cryptically, "Some doors are meant to stay closed." Their reaction only fueled our curiosity. Over the next few weeks, the locked door became an obsession. We researched the history of the house, pored over old city records, even contacted the previous owners, but no one seemed to know anything about a locked room in the basement. Finally, unable to resist any longer, I bought a set of lock picks. "Just to see what's inside," I assured Sarah, who looked uneasy. "We own this house. We have a right to know what's in every room." It took me nearly an hour of fumbling with the picks before I heard the satisfying click of the lock giving way. Sarah and I exchanged a look of excitement tinged with apprehension. Slowly, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The smell hit us first, musty, damp, with an underlying sweetness that made my stomach turn. As our eyes adjusted to the darkness, shapes began to emerge. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of murky liquid. In the center of the room stood a large table, its surface stained dark. "What is this place?" Sarah whispered, her hand gripping my arm tightly. I fumbled for the light switch, dreading what we might see in full illumination. The single bulb flickered to life, casting a sickly yellow glow over the room. The jars on the shelves were filled with things, organic matter suspended in cloudy fluid. Some looked like organs, others like twisted limbs or malformed creatures. Labels in faded handwriting adorned each jar, bearing dates and cryptic notations. But it was the table that drew our attention. The dark stains resolved into intricate patterns, symbols and diagrams etched into the wood with what looked horribly like dried blood. And at the center of the table, a book, large and bound in what appeared to be human skin. The book seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I approached it cautiously, drawn by a morbid fascination. As I reached out to touch it, Sarah grabbed my wrist. "Don't," she said, her voice trembling. "And we need to close this door and forget we ever saw this." But it was too late. My fingers brushed the cover of the book, and a jolt of energy surged through me. The room began to spin, the jars rattling on their shelves. Sarah's scream seemed to come from far away as darkness engulfed me. I woke up in our bed, sunlight streaming through the windows. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. Then I saw Sarah's face, pale and drawn. "You've been out for 2 days," she said quietly. I closed the door, locked it again. I tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced me back down. "What happened?" "The book." Sarah shook her head. "I don't know. But strange things have been happening since you touched it. The lights flicker. I hear whispers in empty rooms. And last night..." She trailed off, her eyes filling with tears. "What?" I pressed. "What happened last night?" She took a deep breath. "I saw something. In the mirror. It wasn't me looking back." Over the next few weeks, the incidents escalated. Objects moved on their own. Dark shadows flitted at the edge of our vision, and always, the feeling of being watched. We tried to ignore it, to go about our lives as if nothing had changed. But we couldn't escape the growing sense of dread, the knowledge that we had unleashed something by opening that door. One night I woke to find Sarah's side of the bed empty. A noise from downstairs drew me out of the bedroom. As I descended the stairs, I saw a light coming from the open basement door. "Sarah," I called out, my voice echoing in the quiet house. No response. With mounting fear, I made my way down to the basement. The door to the hidden room stood open, warm light spilling out. And there was Sarah, standing at the table, the book open before her. "Sarah, don't," I started to say, but she turned to look at me, and the words died in my throat. Her eyes were completely black, her face twisted into an inhuman grin. When she spoke, it wasn't her voice that came out, but a chorus of whispers. "We've been waiting for you." The thing that wasn't Sarah said, "It's time to complete the ritual." I tried to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The shadows in the room seemed to come alive, wrapping around me, pulling me towards the table. I struggled, but it was useless. As I was forced closer to the book, I saw the pages were filled with writing in a language I didn't recognize, accompanied by disturbing illustrations. The whispers grew louder, filling my head with promises of power and knowledge beyond my wildest dreams. For a moment, I was tempted. The secrets of the universe laid out before me. All I had to do was give in, accept the darkness. But then I thought of Sarah, the real Sarah, and the life we had planned together. With every ounce of willpower I possessed, I wrenched myself away from the table. The thing wearing Sarah's face snarled, lunging at me. I ducked, causing it to crash into the shelves. Jars shattered, spilling their horrific contents across the floor. In the chaos, I managed to grab the book and run, up the stairs, through the house, out into the cool night air. Behind me, I could hear inhuman shrieks of rage. I ran until my lungs burned, finally collapsing on the steps of the local church. As I sat there, gasping for breath, I looked down at the book in my hands. It had to be destroyed. But how? The answer came to me as I heard police sirens in the distance, no doubt responding to the disturbance at our house. I waited until I saw the flashing lights, then approached an officer. "I need to report a crime," I said, my voice shaking. "And I need you to destroy this book. Burn it, shred it, I don't care. Just make sure nothing of it remains." The officer looked at me skeptically, but took the book. As soon as it left my hands, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I told them everything, or at least a version of events that wouldn't get me committed to a psychiatric ward. A cult operating out of our basement. Sarah, brainwashed and dangerous. The book, full of their sick ideology. They found Sarah in the basement, confused and with no memory of what had happened. The room was a mess of broken glass and spilled chemicals, but the table and its disturbing etchings were gone, as if they had never existed. We sold the house as soon as we could, moving far away from Maple Street and its secrets. Sarah and I never speak of that night, but sometimes I catch her staring into mirrors with a look of fear in her eyes. And on quiet nights, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear whispers calling me back to that room, to the knowledge I almost embraced. Some doors, I've learned, are meant to stay locked, and some secrets are better left buried, no matter how tempting they might be. But late at night, in my darkest moments, I wonder, did we really escape? Or are we just living on borrowed time, waiting for the darkness to find us again? I pray we never have to find out. The forest had fallen silent, and that's when I knew we were in trouble. As a park ranger for the past decade, I'd grown accustomed to the constant symphony of nature, the chirping of birds, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant calls of larger beasts. But now, as I stood in a small clearing, the silence was deafening. It had started as a routine investigation. Reports of strange noises and a spike in missing hikers had led me deep into a remote section of the forest. I'd brought along Jake, a rookie ranger eager to prove himself. Now, as the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows across our path, I was beginning to regret that decision. "Tim," Jake's voice was barely above a whisper. "Did you hear that?" I held up a hand, signaling for silence. For a moment, there was nothing. Then I heard it, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a mountain lion, wasn't anything I'd heard in my years of working these woods. What the hell was that? Jake's eyes were wide, darting from tree to tree. I shook my head, trying to maintain a calm facade for his sake. "Not sure. Probably just the wind playing tricks on us. Let's keep moving." But as we pressed on, the feeling of wrongness grew. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The path, which should have been familiar, now twisted in ways I didn't recognize. Night was falling fast, faster than it should have. I pulled out my flashlight, its beam cutting through the growing darkness. Jake did the same, and in the intersecting lights, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. Footprints. Massive, inhuman footprints pressed into the soft earth. "Tim," Jake's voice cracked. "Those aren't bear tracks, are they?" I swallowed hard. "No, they're not." The prints were easily twice the size of my own foot, with long, claw-like toes that dug deep into the ground, and they were fresh. "We need to get out of here," I said, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. Now, we turned to retrace our steps, but the path behind us had changed. Where there should have been an open trail, there was now a thick tangle of vegetation, as if the forest itself was conspiring to keep us there. That's when we heard it again, that otherworldly growl, closer this time, much closer. "Run!" I yelled, all pretense of calm abandoned. We crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces, roots seeming to reach up to trip us. I could hear Jake's panicked breathing behind me, punctuated by the snap of twigs and rustle of leaves that told me something was following us. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. In the bobbing beam of my flashlight, I caught a glimpse of our pursuer. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, with a body that seemed to shift between solid and shadow. But it was the eyes that haunted me, glowing orbs of amber that reflected the light like a cat's, but with an intelligence that was terrifyingly human. "Don't look back," I shouted to Jake. "Just keep running." We burst into a small clearing, and for a moment, I thought we might have a chance. But then I heard Jake cry out. I spun around to see him sprawled on the ground, his ankle twisted at an unnatural angle. "Tim, help me," he pleaded, trying to crawl towards me. I stood there, frozen in indecision. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to save myself. But I couldn't leave him. I couldn't. I ran back, grabbing Jake under the arms and hauling him to his feet. He leaned heavily on me as we limped forward, our pace agonizingly slow. The growl came again, so close now I could feel the vibration in my chest. I turned, putting myself between Jake and the approaching creature. It emerged from the tree line, its form seeming to solidify as it stepped into the moonlight. It was like nothing I'd ever seen, part bear, part man, but with elements that seemed to defy classification. Its fur was matted and tangled, hanging in clumps that revealed patches of leathery skin beneath. The face was a nightmare, a bear-like snout filled with jagged teeth, but with eyes that held an unsettling intelligence. "What do we do?" Jake whimpered behind me. I didn't have an answer. My mind raced through our options, each one more hopeless than the last. We couldn't outrun it, couldn't fight it. We were going to die here. in this God-forsaken clearing, and no one would ever know what happened to us. The creature took a step forward, then another. I raised my flashlight, more as a pitiful defense than anything else. The beam caught its eyes, and for a moment, they flared with an otherworldly light. And then, inexplicably, it stopped. The creature tilted its head, as if listening to something we couldn't hear. Its form seemed to ripple, becoming less solid, more shadow-like. And then, with a sound like a gust of wind through dead leaves, it was gone. For a long moment, Jake and I stood there, hardly daring to breathe. The forest around us slowly came back to life, a tentative bird call here, the rustle of a small animal there. Is it gone? Jake asked, his voice trembling. I nodded slowly, still not quite believing it myself. I think so, but we need to get out of here. Now. Supporting Jake, we made our way out of the forest. It took hours, each step a struggle, each shadow holding the potential for fresh terror. But finally, mercifully, we reached the ranger station. The official report was vague. We'd gotten lost, Jake had injured his ankle, and we'd heard some strange animal noises. I couldn't bring myself to include the full truth. Who would believe us? But in the weeks and months that followed, I couldn't shake the memory of that night. I pored over old legends, spoke to local tribes, dug through centuries of folklore, and slowly, a picture began to emerge. The creature we encountered wasn't unique to our forest. Similar sightings had been reported across the country, across the world even. A being that was part animal, part shadow, part something else entirely. Some called it a guardian of the wild places, others a harbinger of nature's vengeance against mankind's encroachment. I don't know what to believe, but I do know this. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows of our so-called civilized world, and sometimes, if we're very lucky, we catch a glimpse of them and live to tell the tale. Jake transferred to a desk job after that night. Can't say I blame him. But me, I'm still out here patrolling these woods, because someone needs to be here, needs to stand between the known and the unknown. And every now and then, when the forest falls silent and the shadows grow long, I feel those amber eyes watching me. And I wonder, was it really letting us go that night? Or was it simply biding its time, waiting for the moment when we let our guard down? I don't have the answers, but I'll keep searching, keep watching. Because in this job, in these woods, vigilance isn't just important, it's survival. The last light flickered out, plunging the library into darkness. That's when I heard the footsteps. I hadn't meant to stay so late. Finals week always turned the university library into a second home for most students, but I'd lost track of time buried in my economics textbooks. The gentle reminder of lights shutting off floor by floor usually sent even the most dedicated studiers packing, but I'd been so engrossed in my notes that I barely noticed the dimming illumination around me. It wasn't until the final overhead light clicked off that I snapped out of my study-induced trance. I blinked, my eyes struggling to adjust to the sudden darkness. The only light now came from my laptop screen, casting an eerie blue glow over my small corner of the vast library. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. "Is anyone still here?" No response, just the faint hum of the ancient heating system and the settling creaks of the old building. I started packing up my things, trying to ignore the growing unease in the pit of my stomach. It was silly to be scared. I'd spent countless late nights in this library, but something felt different tonight. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more oppressive. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere in the stacks behind me. I froze, my hand halfway to my backpack. "Hello?" I called again, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize it was closing time. I'm leaving now." The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, so faint I almost thought I'd imagined it, came a whisper. "Stay." A chill ran down my spine. That voice, it didn't sound human. It was more like the rustle of pages, the creak of old leather bindings, a library given voice. I grabbed my backpack, shoving my laptop inside with shaking hands. Whatever was going on, I didn't want to stick around to find out. As I stood, my chair scraped loudly against the floor. The sound echoed through the empty library, and in response, the footsteps started again. Faster now, and closer. I ran. My footsteps pounded against the carpeted floor as I sprinted towards the main staircase. Behind me, I could hear the pursuit. Not just one set of footsteps now, but many, and voices, whispering in that same papery tone. Stay, read, learn. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my breath coming in ragged gasps. 5 floors down to the exit. It felt like an eternity. As I reached the 3rd floor landing, a book came flying out of the darkness. Narrowly missing my head, I ducked, nearly losing my balance. More books followed, an impossible barrage. How were they doing this? Who were they? I didn't have time to ponder. I just ran, shielding my face with one arm as I descended. 2nd floor. The whispers were getting louder, more insistent. I could almost make out words now, promises of knowledge and power. Part of me, a small, traitorous part, wanted to stop and listen, to turn around and see what was offering these temptations. I shook my head, dispelling the thought. Whatever was behind me, it wasn't something I wanted to face. 1st floor. I could see the exit now, the glass doors that led to safety. But as I approached, my heart sank. The doors were chained shut, a large padlock glinting in the faint emergency lighting. No, 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 I muttered, yanking futilely at the chains. This couldn't be happening. The library was supposed to be open 24/7 during finals week. Why would they lock up? The footsteps were close now. I could hear them on the stairs, descending with an awful, measured pace. They knew I was trapped. I spun around, pressing my back against the doors. The main lobby stretched out before me, seeming far larger and darker than I remembered. Shadows moved in the periphery of my vision, always vanishing when I tried to look directly at them. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. The whispers rose to a crescendo, a susurration of voices that seemed to come from the very walls. Knowledge, power, eternity. A figure emerged from the darkness. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary librarian, an older woman in a cardigan and glasses. But as she stepped closer, I realized with growing horror that she wasn't walking. She was gliding, her feet hovering inches above the ground, and her skin. It was pale and textured, like parchment. "Welcome, young scholar," she said, her voice a dry rustle. "We've been waiting for someone like you. Someone with a thirst for knowledge." More figures appeared behind her. Students, professors, librarians, all with that same papery skin, all floating inches off the ground. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light, filled with ancient wisdom and terrible hunger. "Join us," the librarian continued, extending a hand towards me. "Become one with the books. Learn the secrets of the universe." For a moment, I was tempted. The promise of unlimited knowledge, of unlocking the mysteries of existence. It was intoxicating. But then I saw the books scattered on the floor around them. Books with covers that looked disturbingly like human skin. And I understood. "No," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "I don't want your knowledge, I want to leave." The librarian's face twisted into a snarl, all pretense of humanity vanishing. "You don't have a choice," she hissed. "The library has chosen you. You will join our collection." They surged forward, paper-thin hands reaching for me. I closed my eyes, bracing for the inevitable. But instead of cold, papery fingers, I felt a rush of warm air. My eyes snapped open to see the chains on the door glowing red hot. With a loud crack, they shattered. I didn't hesitate. I shoved the doors open and ran into the cool night air. Behind me, I heard inhuman shrieks of rage and frustration, but I didn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. When I finally stopped, gasping for breath, I found myself on the other side of campus. The library loomed in the distance, looking deceptively normal under the moonlight. But I knew the truth now. I knew what lurked within its walls when darkness fell. I never went back to that library. I finished my degree taking classes online, making excuses to my friends and professors about why I couldn't study on campus anymore. They wouldn't have believed the truth anyway. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear whispers, the rustle of pages, the creak of leather bindings, and I wonder, did I really escape? Or did a part of me stay behind in that library, forever trapped in the realm of forbidden knowledge? I try not to think about it too much, but I can't help but notice how my skin sometimes looks a little too pale, a little too papery. And when I read, the words seem to sink into me in a way they never did before. So if you're ever studying late in a library, and you find yourself alone when the lights go out, remember my story, and run. Run before the books decide they want to add you to their collection, because some knowledge comes at too high a price, and some libraries never let their patrons leave. The last customer should have left an hour ago, but I could still hear footsteps in the dark aisles of the bookstore. I'd been working at Midnight Pages for almost a year now, and the late shift had become second nature to me. As a college student, the quiet hours from 8 p.m. to midnight were perfect for catching up on homework between the occasional customer. Tonight, though, something felt off. It started with a man who came in just before closing. Tall, thin, with a face that seemed oddly forgettable. He nodded at me as he passed the counter, then disappeared into the maze of shelves. I thought nothing of it at first. We often had last-minute browsers, and I was used to gently reminding them of our closing time. But as 11:30 rolled around and I began my usual closing routine, I realized I hadn't seen him leave. "Excuse me, sir," I called out, my voice echoing in the cavernous space. "We'll be closing in 30 minutes. No response. I frowned, setting down the stack of returns I'd been organizing. The store wasn't that big. 2 floors, sure, but nothing someone could get lost in. I walked through the aisles of the ground floor, peering down each one. Romance, mystery, sci-fi, all empty. "Sir," I tried again, louder this time. "I'm sorry, but you'll need to make your purchases soon. We close at midnight." Still nothing. Just the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the faint ticking of the large clock above the information desk. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the old wood. History, biography, travel, all deserted. A chill ran down my spine as I realized I was alone in the store, or at least I should have been, but I could have sworn I heard the soft rustle of pages being turned, coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, heart racing. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Silence greeted me, but as I stood there, straining my ears, I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of a book being pulled from a shelf, followed by the whisper of pages. "This isn't funny," I called out, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "We're closed. You need to leave now." I made my way back downstairs, my eyes darting to every shadow, every dark corner. The clock read 11:50, 10 minutes until closing, and then I could lock up and get out of here. I returned to the counter, my hands shaking slightly as I counted out the register. Every few seconds, I'd pause, listening intently. There it was again. Footsteps, soft but distinct, moving between the aisles. 11:55. 5 minutes to go. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of eyes following my every move from the darkness of the store. I grabbed my phone, ready to call campus security, but as I looked at the screen, my blood ran cold. No signal. That was impossible. We always had reception in here. I'd spent countless hours texting friends and scrolling through social media during slow shifts. But now, when I needed it most, nothing. The lights flickered, and for a heart-stopping moment I thought they might go out entirely. They steadied, but seemed dimmer somehow, casting long shadows across the store. 11:59. 1 minute left. I could do this. Just 60 more seconds, and I'd be out of here. I grabbed my keys, ready to make a dash for the door the moment the clock struck midnight, and then I heard it. A voice, low and raspy, coming from directly behind me. "Excuse me, miss, I'm ready to check out now." I whirled around, a scream catching in my throat. There he was, the man from earlier, standing at the counter as if he'd been there all along. In his hands was a large, leather-bound book I didn't recognize from our inventory. I'm sorry, sir, but we're closed," I managed to stammer out. "You'll have to come back tomorrow." He smiled, and something about that smile made my skin crawl. It was too wide, too many teeth. "Oh, I'm afraid that won't be possible. You see, I've been waiting a very long time for this particular volume." He placed the book on the counter, and I couldn't help but look down at it. The cover was blank, no title, no author, just smooth black leather that seemed to absorb the light around it. "This isn't I said, finding a shred of courage. "I can't sell you something that isn't in our inventory." His smile widened impossibly further. "Oh, but it is. It's been here all along, waiting for the right reader, and now it's found one." I blinked, and in that split second, he was gone. The book remained on the counter, a dark presence that seemed to pulse with its own energy. The lights went out. I fumbled for my phone, using its faint glow to illuminate the space around me. The store had changed. The familiar aisles were gone, replaced by towering shelves that stretched up into darkness. Books floated off the shelves, their pages fluttering like wings, and everywhere I looked, I saw eyes, watching, waiting, hungry. I ran, through twisted corridors of books, past whispering shadows and grasping tendrils of darkness. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs ached, but no matter how far I went, I couldn't find the exit. I don't know how long I ran. Hours, days, maybe even years. Time had no meaning in this place, but eventually, I found myself back at the counter where it all began. The book was still there, waiting. With trembling hands, I reached out and opened it. The pages were blank, but as I watched, words began to appear. My story, my life, written out in flowing script, and at the end, a choice. Stay and become part of the store's collection, a living book, full of stories and experiences for others to read, or leave, but take the knowledge of this place with me, never again to find peace in the written word. Always wondering if the next book I opened might pull me back in, I made my choice. The next morning, a young woman arrived to open the store. She found everything as it should be, shelves neatly organized, floors clean, register balanced. If she noticed the new employee behind the counter, a quiet girl with haunted eyes who seemed to know the location of every book without checking the computer, she didn't mention it. And if sometimes, late at night when the store was empty, she heard the sound of pages turning or footsteps in the aisles, well, that was just part of working in an old bookstore, wasn't it? But you, dear reader, now you know the truth. So the next time you're browsing in a bookstore late at night, and you feel eyes watching you from the shadows, remember my tale. And whatever you do, don't open any books you don't recognize. Because once you start reading, you might never stop. The store is always looking for new stories, new experiences to add to its collection, and it's very, very patient. I should know. I've been here for a long time now, watching, waiting for the right reader. Maybe it's you. Maybe you're the one I've been waiting for all these years. So tell me, are you ready to check out? The book is waiting. All you have to do is open it. But remember, once you start reading, there's no guarantee you'll ever be able to close the book again. The choice is yours. Choose wisely. The streetlights went out all at once, plunging the neighborhood into an unnatural darkness. That's when I heard the first inhuman growl. I'd always been a night owl, finding peace in the quiet hours when most of the world was asleep. My nightly walks through our sleepy suburban neighborhood had become a ritual, a way to clear my head after long days hunched over a computer screen. I knew every crack in the sidewalk, every overgrown hedge, every house with a porch light left on all night. But tonight was different. There was a tension in the air, a stillness that felt more like the calm before a storm than the usual tranquility of midnight. I'd almost decided to cut my walk short when it happened. One by one, in rapid succession, the streetlights flickered and died. It wasn't the gradual dimming of a power outage, but a synchronized extinguishing, as if someone had flipped a giant switch. In the span of a heartbeat, the familiar streets were swallowed by darkness. I stopped in my tracks, my eyes struggling to adjust. The houses around me were dark too, not a single window glowing with the blue light of a TV or the warm yellow of a lamp. It was as if the entire neighborhood had been cut off from the world. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't a dog's bark or a cat's yowl. It was something else, something that didn't belong in this quiet suburban landscape. I turned slowly, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. In the darkness, shapes seemed to move and shift, playing tricks on my eyes. Was that a tree swaying in the wind, or something more sinister? The growl came again, closer this time, and now there was more than one. The sound seemed to be coming from all around me, encircling me in a predatory chorus. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew that was the worst thing I could do. Whatever was out there, running would only trigger its chase response. So I stood perfectly still, barely breathing, straining my eyes against the darkness. That's when I saw them. Eyes. Dozens of pairs of eyes, glowing an unnatural green in the night. They were at varying heights, some close to the ground, others level with my own gaze, suggesting creatures of different sizes. One pair of eyes, larger than the rest, blinked slowly. As it did, I caught a glimpse of the creature it belonged to. It was vaguely canine in shape, but far larger than any dog I'd ever seen. Its fur seemed to absorb what little light there was, creating a silhouette of pure darkness. I took a hesitant step backward, and the creature's head snapped towards me. A low growl rumbled from its throat, a sound that seemed to vibrate the very air around me. In that moment, I knew I was no longer at the top of the food chain. These things, whatever they were predators, and I was prey. I broke into a run, all thoughts of staying still forgotten in the face of pure, primal fear. Behind me, I could hear the creatures giving chase, their paws thundering against the pavement. I sprinted down the familiar streets, now made alien by the darkness and the monstrous pursuit. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror kept me moving. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see gaining on me. As I rounded a corner, I saw salvation. My house, just a block away. If I could make it inside, maybe I'd be safe. Maybe these things couldn't enter without invitation, like vampires in old stories. I put on a final burst of speed, fumbling in my pocket for my keys as I ran. Behind me, the growls and snarls grew louder, closer. I could feel hot breath on the back of my neck, sharp teeth just inches from closing around my throat. I reached my front door, my shaking hands struggling with the lock. Just as I felt teeth graze my ankle, I tumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind me. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a heavy thud against the door. Another. The wood creaked and groaned under the assault. I scrambled away, my back pressed against the far wall of the entryway, watching in horror as the door bulged inward with each impact. But it held. After what felt like an eternity, the pounding stopped. I could hear snuffling sounds outside, like enormous creatures scenting the air. Then, slowly, the sounds retreated. I stayed there, huddled on the floor, for hours. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, I finally found the courage to look outside. The street was normal, quiet, empty. The streetlights were on, bathing everything in their familiar orange glow. There was no sign of the monstrous creatures that had chased me, no evidence of the terror I'd experienced. Had I imagined it all? Was it some kind of vivid hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep? But as I opened the door, my foot crunched on something. I looked down to see deep claw marks scored into the wood, far larger than any normal animal could make. And there, on the welcome mat, was a tuft of jet black fur that seemed to swallow the light around it. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself it had been a dream. I went about my routine, went to work, came home. But I didn't take any more night walks, and I noticed things. The way my neighbors kept their children closer, their dogs inside. The nervous glances people cast at the tree line at the edge of the suburb. The way conversations would stop when I approached, as if everyone shared a secret they didn't want me to know. A week after that night, I ran into Mrs. Johnson from down the street. She was walking her tiny Pomeranian, which was strange in itself. She used to let it run free in her fenced backyard. As we exchanged pleasantries, her eyes kept darting around, as if watching for something. Finally, she leaned in close. "You've seen them, haven't you?" she whispered. "The night hunters. They've been here for generations, but they usually stay in the deep woods. Something's drawn them closer lately. Be careful after dark, dear, and whatever you do, don't invite them in." Before I could respond, she hurried away, practically dragging her yapping dog behind her. That night, as I sat in my living room, all the lights blazing, I heard it again. That low, inhuman growl coming from just outside my window. I froze, my eyes fixed on the curtains, afraid of what I might see if I looked out. A shadow passed by, larger than any normal animal, then another, and another. They moved with an unnatural grace, silent except for those bone-chilling growls. I sat there all night, watching the shadows move past my windows. As dawn approached, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold, scratching at my door. Then, a voice, if you could call it that. It was more like the idea of a voice, a sound that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to my mind. "Let us in," it said, its tone a mixture of command and seduction. "We've been waiting so long. Let us in, and all the secrets of the night will be yours." I squeezed my eyes shut, covering my ears even though I knew it wouldn't help. "No," I whispered. "You're not welcome here. Go away." There was a pause, then a sound like a sigh, equal parts disappointment and hunger. "As you wish," the voice said, "but we'll be waiting. We're always waiting." When I opened my eyes, sunlight was streaming through the windows. The street outside was normal, filled with the sounds of my neighbors starting their day. But things had changed. I knew now that the night held secrets, dangers that most people never saw. And I knew that those dangers were watching, waiting for an invitation, a moment of weakness. I still live here, in this quiet suburban neighborhood. I still see my neighbors, go to work, try to live a normal life. But I don't take walks at night anymore. I keep my doors and windows locked, line them with salt like Mrs. Johnson suggested. And every night, as darkness falls, I listen for those growls, watch for those glowing eyes, because now I know the truth. The night is alive, and it's hungry, And sometimes, it comes hunting in places we think are safe. So if you're ever out late and the street lights suddenly go out, leaving you in unnatural darkness, run, run, and don't look back. Because the night hunters might be after you next. And once they've got your scent, they never really go away. They just wait for you to invite them in. The security cameras showed an empty floor, but the footsteps echoing through the darkness told a different story. I'd been working as a night security guard at Oakwood Plaza for about 6 months. It was a cushy job, perfect for a grad student like me. Most nights, I'd patrol the empty offices, check a few locks, and spend the rest of my shift studying or watching movies on my laptop. Nothing ever happened, until tonight. It started like any other shift. I arrived at 10 p.m., relieved the day guard, and settled into the security office on the ground floor. The plaza was a massive, 20-story office building, home to various companies ranging from tech startups to law firms. At night, it was a ghost town. I did my first round at 11, taking the elevator up to the top floor and working my way down. Everything was normal. Locked doors, empty corridors, the occasional cleaning crew finishing up for the night. By midnight, I was back in the security office, feet up on the desk, textbook open in front of me. That's when I first noticed it. A soft beeping from one of the security monitors caught my attention. I looked up to see a motion alert flashing on the screen for the 15th floor. Probably just a janitor I'd missed on my rounds, I thought. But as I switched to that camera feed, my blood ran cold. The hallway was empty. I cycled through the other cameras on that floor. Nothing. Not a soul in sight. But the motion sensor was still triggering. Its alert now a constant, irritating buzz. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Technical glitch, I told myself. These systems weren't exactly cutting edge. I made a note to report it to maintenance in the morning and tried to return to my studying, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept darting back to that monitor, half expecting to see something, anything to explain the alert. After about 10 minutes of this, I decided to check it out myself. If nothing else, it would break up the monotony of the night. The elevator ride up to the 15th floor felt longer than usual. As the doors slid open, I was hit by a wall of silence. Not unusual for an empty office at 1 a.m., dear, but somehow more noticeable tonight. I stepped out, flashlight in one hand, radio in the other. Security, doing a check on 15, I said into the radio, more to hear a voice than out of any real need to report. My words echoed in the empty hallway. I made my way down the corridor, beam of light sweeping from side to side. Everything looked normal. No signs of intrusion, no equipment left on, nothing out of place. I was about to chalk it up to a faulty sensor and head back when I heard it. Footsteps, coming from around the corner. I froze, listening intently. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of shoes on carpet moving at a steady pace. But as I shone my light in that direction, I saw nothing. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is security. Identify yourself." No response. Just more footsteps, now seeming to come from multiple directions. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I fumbled for my radio. "This is Anderson on 15. I've got a situation here. Possible intruder." Static was my only answer. I tried again, but the radio remained stubbornly silent. The footsteps were getting closer now, surrounding me. But every time I turned to face them, my light revealed only empty space. It was as if the sounds were coming from invisible bodies, moving freely through the office. I backed up against a wall, trying to keep all directions in view. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The security camera in the corner of the hallway. Its red recording light was off. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone. No signal. Of course. The footsteps stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I could hear my own ragged breathing, too loud in the stillness. Then, a whisper, right next to my ear. "You don't belong here." I ran. Blind panic propelled me through the hallways, not caring about direction, just needing to get away. I slammed into the stairwell door, taking the steps two at a time in my haste to descend. As I reached the 10th floor landing, I heard a door above me open and slam shut. Footsteps on the stairs, racing down after me. But when I looked up, I saw no one. I burst out of the stairwell on the ground floor, sprinting for the security office. I'd call for help, get the police here, anything to not be alone with. Whatever this was. But as I rounded the corner, I skidded to a halt. The security office door was open, swinging gently on its hinges. I was certain I'd locked it when I left. With nowhere else to go, I edged into the room. The bank of monitors that usually showed feeds from all over the building were dark, all except one. The screen for the 15th floor was on, showing the hallway I'd just fled. And there, in the center of the screen, was a figure. It was shadow-given form, a darkness deeper than the surrounding night. As I watched, paralyzed with fear, it turned to face the camera. Where its face should have been, there was only a swirling void. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at the camera, at me, and then the screen went black. I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out, because the next thing I knew, I was being shaken awake by the day guard. I was huddled under the desk in the security office, babbling about invisible intruders and dark figures. They didn't believe me, of course. The security footage showed nothing unusual, just me wandering around the 15th floor before running back to the office and hiding. The motion sensor alert was blamed on a glitch in the system. Case closed. I quit that day. Couldn't bear the thought of spending another night in that building. But even now, months later, I can't shake the memory of those footsteps. That whisper, that pointing figure on the screen. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear them. Soft footsteps in my empty apartment, a whisper just on the edge of hearing. And I wonder, did I really escape that night? Or did something follow me home? I've taken to sleeping with the lights on, my back to the wall. I check and recheck the locks on my doors and windows. But deep down, I know it won't matter. Because whatever was in that building, whatever chased me through those empty halls, it wasn't stopped by locked doors or solid walls. It's out there waiting. And someday, when I least expect it, I'll hear those footsteps again, coming for me. So I stay vigilant. I avoid dark places, empty buildings. I never work night shifts anymore. But still, I feel watched. Still, I hear whispers in the silence. And I wonder, in my darkest moments, if I ever really left that 15th floor. Or if, perhaps, a part of me is still there, running through those endless hallways, chased by shadows that should not exist. Because in the end, that's the true horror. Not the things that go bump in the night, but the realization that sometimes the monsters follow you home. And once they've found you, they never really let you go. So if you're ever alone in a dark, empty place, and you hear footsteps with no source, or whispers with no speaker, remember my story, and run, and pray that you're faster than the darkness that's coming for you. Because sometimes, the things we can't see are the most terrifying of all. The laughter of children echoing through empty hallways is unsettling enough. But when I followed the muddy footprints to a classroom that should have been locked, I knew this was no ordinary night shift. I'd been working as a night janitor at Millbrook Elementary for about 6 months. It was an easy gig. Mop the floors, clean the bathrooms, make sure everything was tidy for the next day. The solitude suited me. After a messy divorce and a string of dead-end jobs, the quiet nights gave me time to think, to plan my next move. That night started like any other. I arrived just as the last of the after-school programs were wrapping up. nodding to the tired-looking teachers as they headed out. By 8 p.m., the school was empty, and I started my usual routine. I was mopping the main hallway when I first heard it. A giggle, high-pitched and playful, coming from somewhere down the corridor. I froze, mop in hand, straining my ears. For a moment, there was nothing. Then it came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of running feet. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty space. "Is someone there?" No response, just another burst of giggles, now sounding further away. I set down my mop and started walking towards the sound. It wasn't unusual for a kid to get left behind occasionally, though it had never happened this late before. As I rounded the corner, I saw them. Small, muddy footprints leading down the hallway. My first thought was annoyance. I'd just cleaned that floor. But as I followed the trail, a sense of unease began to grow. The footprints were small, definitely a child's, but there was something off about them. They were too perfect, too evenly spaced, and they seemed to shimmer slightly in the dim emergency lighting, as if the mud was still wet. The trail led me to the door of classroom 205. I knew it should be locked. I'd checked all the doors at the start of my shift, as always. But as I reached for the handle, I heard it again. Laughter, coming from inside the room. Multiple voices this time. I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob. Something about this felt wrong. Very wrong. But I was the only adult in the building. If there were kids in there, it was my responsibility to get them out safely. Taking a deep breath, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The classroom was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the emergency exit sign. At first glance, it seemed empty. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw them. Small figures, huddled in the back corner of the room. 3, maybe 4 of them. "Hey there," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and friendly. "Are you kids lost? Let's get you home to your parents." They didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there, unnaturally still. I took a step into the room, fumbling for the light switch. "It's okay," I said. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm just here to help." My fingers found the switch, and I flicked it on. The fluorescent lights flickered to life, illuminating the classroom. And in that moment, I felt my heart stop. The figures in the corner weren't children, at least, not anymore. They were something else. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over 2 sharp bones. Their eyes were huge, black, and utterly devoid of life. And their mouths were split into wide, impossible grins, filled with needle-like teeth. For a heartbeat, we just stared at each other. Then, as one, they began to move towards me. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like marionettes controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. I stumbled backward, slamming the door shut. I could hear them on the other side, their little fists pounding against the wood, those high-pitched giggles now sounding more like shrieks. I ran. Down the hallway, past my abandoned mop, not stopping until I reached the main office. With shaking hands, I called 911. "There's someone in the school," I gasped when the operator answered. "In classroom 205. I think they might be trying to hurt the children." I couldn't bring myself to tell her what I'd really seen. Who would believe me? The police arrived within minutes. I led them to the classroom, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. But when they opened the door, the room was empty. No sign of the child things. No evidence anyone had been there at all. The officers were sympathetic but skeptical. They searched the school but found nothing out of the ordinary. One of them gently suggested that maybe I'd been working too hard, that stress can play tricks on the mind. I nodded, mumbled something about lack of sleep, and watched them leave, but I knew what I'd seen. Those things had been real. I finished my shift in a daze, jumping at every sound, half expecting to hear that laughter again. But the school remained quiet, almost unnaturally so. As I was locking up, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The muddy footprints I'd followed earlier were gone. The floor was spotless, as if I'd never mopped it at all. I quit the next day. Couldn't bear the thought of spending another night in that school. But even now, months later, I can't shake the memory of what I saw. Those not children, with their too wide grins and empty eyes. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can hear their laughter. Distant, but getting closer. And I wonder, did I really escape that night? Or did something follow me home? I've tried to move on, to forget, but every time I pass a school, every time I hear children laughing, I feel that same cold dread creep over me. Because now I know the truth. There are things in this world that shouldn't exist. Things that wear the faces of innocence to hide their true nature. And sometimes, when the night is dark and the halls are empty, they come out to play. I've never told anyone else what I saw that night. Who would believe me? But I know it was real. As real as the nightmares that still wake me up, drenched in sweat, the echo of childish laughter ringing in my ears. So if you're ever alone in a school at night, and you hear the sound of children playing when there should be no one there, don't investigate. Don't follow the sound. Just run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Because some games, once you start playing, you can never stop. And some players don't like to lose. I still drive by Millbrook Elementary sometimes, usually late at night when I can't sleep. The school looks normal enough in the daylight. But at night, when the shadows are long and the windows are dark, I swear I can see small figures moving inside, waiting, watching, and sometimes, just sometimes, I hear that laughter again. Faint, but unmistakable. A reminder that some things, once seen, can never be unseen, and some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. So I keep driving, never stopping, always looking over my shoulder, because I know now that the monsters are real, and they wear the faces of children. The scratching at the back door wasn't our dog. I knew because Rover was right next to me, hackles raised and growling low in his throat. I'd been house-sitting for my neighbors, the Johnsons, for a week now. Their sprawling suburban home was a far cry from my cramped apartment, and I'd been enjoying the change of scenery. That is, until tonight. It started around 10 p.m. I was settled on the couch, mindlessly scrolling through my phone while some reality TV show droned on in the background. Rover, the Johnsons, usually placid German shepherd, was curled up at my feet. The first odd thing I noticed was Rover's ears perking up. He lifted his head, alert and focused on something I couldn't perceive. I muted the TV, straining my ears, but heard nothing unusual. "What is it, boy?" I asked, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. But instead of leaning into my touch as he usually did, Rover stood up, his body tense. That's when I heard it. A soft, scratching sound, coming from the direction of the back door. At first, I dismissed it as a branch scraping against the house in the wind. But as I listened, I realized the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate to be caused by the weather. Rover's low growl startled me. In the week I'd been here, I'd never heard him make a sound like that. His eyes were fixed on the hallway leading to the back of the house, his teeth bared in a snarl. I stood up slowly, my heart beginning to race. "Hello," I called out, immediately regretting it. If there was someone trying to break in, I'd just alerted them to my presence. The scratching stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I reached for my phone, ready to call 911, when Rover suddenly bolted down the hallway, barking furiously. I heard the back door rattle in its frame, as if something had slammed against it. "Rover!" I shouted, running after him. I skidded to a stop in the kitchen, fumbling for the light switch. The fluorescent lights flickered to life, revealing Rover standing at the back door, his barks now interspersed with vicious snarls. I approached cautiously, peering out the small window in the door. At first, I saw nothing but the darkened backyard. Then, a movement caught my eye. A figure, crouched by the rose bushes at the edge of the patio. It was too dark to make out details, but something about its shape seemed off. My trembling fingers finally managed to dial 911. As I waited for the operator to pick up, I kept my eyes fixed on the yard, searching for another glimpse of the intruder. 911, what's your emergency? I opened my mouth to respond, but the words died in my throat. The figure had stood up, and in the dim light from the kitchen window, I could see it clearly now. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long and jointed in places they shouldn't be. Its skin was pale, almost translucent in the moonlight, stretched tight over a frame that was decidedly inhuman. But it was the face that made my blood run cold. Where there should have been eyes, nose, and mouth, there was only smooth, featureless skin. I must have made a sound, a whimper of terror perhaps, because the thing's head snapped towards me. It took a step forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. Rover's barking reached a fever pitch. He threw himself at the door, his claws scrabbling against the wood. "Hello? Are you there? What's your emergency?" The operator's voice seemed to come from very far away. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I could only watch in horror as the creature glided across the yard, coming closer and closer to the door. It raised a hand, if you could call it that. Long, spindly fingers ended in sharp points that looked more like claws than nails. As I watched, frozen in terror, it began to scratch at the door again. The sound snapped me out of my paralysis. "There's something, trying to get in." I managed to gasp into the phone. "Please, send help, now." "Ma'am, I need you to calm down," the operator said, her voice steady and professional. Can you tell me your location?" I rattled off the Johnson's address, my eyes never leaving the creature at the door. It was pressing its face, or where its face should be, against the window now, as if trying to peer inside. "Officers are on their way," the operator assured me. "Is there somewhere safe you can go until they arrive?" I nodded, then realized she couldn't see me. "Yes," I croaked. "The basement. There's a lock on the door." "Good. Go there now, and stay on the line with me." I began to back away slowly, reaching down to grab Rover's collar, but he wouldn't budge, still snarling and snapping at the door. "Rover, come," I pleaded, tugging at his collar. "We have to go." The scratching at the door intensified, becoming more frantic. I heard wood splintering and realized with dawning horror that the lock wouldn't hold for long. In desperation, I scooped Rover up, no easy feat given his size, and half carried, half dragged him towards the basement door. His barks echoed through the house, punctuated by the increasingly violent sounds of the creature trying to break in. We had just reached the basement door when I heard it, the sickening crack of wood giving way. Rover redoubled his efforts to get free, nearly wriggling out of my grasp. "It's in!" I screamed into the phone. "Oh God, it's inside." I wrenched open the basement door and practically threw Rover down the stairs before following, slamming and locking the door behind us. The basement was pitch black. I fumbled for the light switch, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage it. When the lights finally came on, I wedged a heavy shelf in front of the door for good measure. Rover was at the bottom of the stairs, still barking up at the door. I could hear heavy footsteps above us, moving with unnatural speed through the house. "The police are almost there," the 911 operator said, her voice tinny through the phone's speaker. "Just stay where you are. Don't make any noise." I pressed myself into a corner, trying to make myself as small as possible. Rover had finally stopped barking, and was now pressed against my legs, trembling. The footsteps stopped directly above us. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, deliberately, something began to descend the basement stairs. Step, scratch, step, scratch. I held my breath, my eyes fixed on the door. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. I could see the wood beginning to splinter around the lock. Just as I was certain the door would give way, I heard the blessed sound of sirens in the distance. The scratching stopped abruptly. There was a moment of stillness, then a flurry of movement above. I heard the back door slam, followed by the sound of breaking glass, probably the creature leaping through a window. By the time the police arrived, the house was silent. They found me huddled in the basement corner, clutching Rover tightly. The back door was in splinters, and long, deep claw marks scored the wood of the basement door. But of the creature itself, there was no sign. The official report chalked it up to an attempted break-in, albeit by an unusually strong and determined burglar. They increased patrols in the neighborhood for a few weeks, but eventually, life returned to normal. Except it didn't. Not for me. I see it sometimes, late at night. A tall, impossibly thin figure at the edge of my vision. When I turn to look, it's gone. But I know it's out there, waiting. And every time I hear a dog bark in the night, or the scratch of branches against my window, I'm right back in that basement, wondering if this time the lock will hold. Because deep down, I know the truth. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human, and someday, somehow, it will be back. Until then, I keep my doors locked, my curtains drawn, and I never ever answer unexpected scratching in the night. The stranger at the foot of my bed didn't move when I opened my eyes. He just stood there, watching, as if he had all the time in the world. I'd always been a light sleeper, prone to waking at the slightest disturbance. So when I felt the weight of someone's gaze on me in the middle of the night, my eyes snapped open almost instantly. At first, in the disorienting haze between sleep and wakefulness, I thought I must be dreaming. The silhouette of a man, unnaturally tall and thin, stood motionless at the foot of my bed. I blinked hard, expecting the apparition to vanish, but when I opened my eyes again, he was still there. The dim moonlight filtering through my curtains wasn't enough to make out any features, just the vague outline of a person where no person should be. My heart began to race, adrenaline flooding my system as the reality of the situation sank in. There was an intruder in my bedroom. How had he gotten in? I always locked my doors and windows. I lived alone in a second-floor apartment. This shouldn't be possible. I lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe, hoping against hope that if I didn't move, he somehow wouldn't notice I was awake. But as the seconds ticked by and he remained motionless, a new fear began to creep in. What if this wasn't a regular intruder? What if this was something else? Gathering every ounce of courage I possessed, I reached out slowly towards my bedside lamp. The stranger didn't react, didn't move an inch. My fingers closed around the switch, and I flicked it on, flooding the room with light. The foot of my bed was empty. I sat up, my eyes darting around the room. There was no sign of the figure, no indication that anyone had been there at all. The door was still closed, the windows locked. Everything was exactly as it should be. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No response. I got out of bed on unsteady legs, checking every corner of my small apartment. The living room was empty, the kitchen undisturbed, the front door was still locked and chained. I even looked in the closets and under the bed, feeling a bit foolish but needing to be sure. Nothing. By the time I finished my search, I had almost convinced myself it had been a particularly vivid dream. Stress-induced sleep paralysis, perhaps. I'd been working long hours lately, my sleep schedule all over the place. It wasn't too far-fetched to think my mind might be playing tricks on me. I crawled back into bed, leaving the lamp on. Just as I was about to close my eyes, I heard it. A soft exhalation of breath, coming from the far corner of the room. I froze, my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. Slowly, ever so slowly. I turned my head towards the sound. There he was, the stranger, now standing in the corner, watching me with eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the lamplight. But as I focused on his face, trying to make out his features, they seemed to shift and blur, never quite resolving into anything recognizably human. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The stranger took a step forward, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. In a panic, I squeezed my eyes shut, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a dream, a hallucination, anything but reality. I counted to 10, taking deep breaths, trying to calm my racing heart. When I opened my eyes again, the corner was empty. I let out a shaky laugh, relief washing over me. It was just my imagination after all. I was about to turn off the lamp when a whisper, right next to my ear, made my blood run cold. "Do you really think closing your eyes will make me disappear?" I leapt out of bed with a strangled cry, spinning around to face nothing. The room was empty once again. That was the moment I decided I couldn't stay in the apartment. Dream or hallucination or supernatural visitation, I didn't care. I just knew I couldn't spend another minute there. I threw on some clothes, grabbed my phone and keys, and ran out the door. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, parked on the street below. As I fumbled with the keys, I glanced up at my bedroom window. The stranger was there, watching me from behind the glass. Even from this distance, I could feel the weight of his gaze. As I stared, paralyzed with fear, he raised a hand and waved, almost playfully. I got in my car and drove, no destination in mind, just needing to put distance between myself and whatever was in my apartment. I ended up at an all-night diner on the outskirts of town, nursing a cup of coffee as the sun began to rise. By daylight, the whole experience seemed absurd. I must have been dreaming, or maybe I was coming down with something. Fever dreams could be incredibly vivid, right? I almost managed to convince myself it had all been in my head. Almost. Because as I raised my mug to take another sip, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the diner's window. And there, just behind my shoulder, was the blurred outline of a tall, thin figure. I dropped the mug, hot coffee spilling across the table. The waitress rushed over, asking if I was okay. But I couldn't take my eyes off the window. The figure was gone, but I knew what I'd seen. I left the diner in a daze, unsure of what to do next. I couldn't go home, couldn't face the thought of being alone in that apartment again. But where could I go? Who would believe me if I told them what was happening? In the end, I checked into a cheap hotel. I told myself it was just for a night or two, just until I could figure things out. But deep down, I knew there was no figuring this out. Whatever was happening to me, whatever was following me, it wasn't something that could be explained away or reasoned with. That first night in the motel, I didn't sleep. I sat in a chair facing the door, lights on, TV blaring for company. Every shadow, every movement in my peripheral vision had me on edge, but nothing appeared. As dawn broke, I began to hope. Maybe it was over. Maybe whatever it was had been tied to my apartment, and by leaving, I'd escaped it. Then my phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number. With trembling fingers, I opened it. It was a picture of me, sitting in that very chair, taken from an angle that could only have been from the foot of the bed. In the background, barely visible in the shadows, was the outline of a tall, thin figure. The message below the photo read, "You can't escape me. I'm always watching." I threw the phone across the room, where it shattered against the wall. But it didn't matter. The damage was done. The realization sank in, heavy and terrifying. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't confined to my apartment. It was following me, and it could interact with the physical world. In the days that followed, I tried everything. I went to the police here, but they dismissed my story as paranoia or a practical joke gone too far. I saw a psychiatrist, who prescribed medication for hallucinations. I even consulted a local psychic, desperate for any explanation or solution. Nothing helped. The figure kept appearing, always just at the edge of my vision, always gone when I turned to look directly at it. Sometimes it would move things in my room while I was out. Once, I came back to find all my framed photos turned to face the wall. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything but the constant, gnawing fear of when and where it would appear next. My friends started to worry, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth. Who would believe me? And now, as I sit here writing this, I can feel it. That familiar weight of unseen eyes watching me. I know that if I turn around, I'll catch a glimpse of it standing in the corner, but I won't turn. I've learned that acknowledging it only makes things worse. So I keep typing, pretending I don't see the shadow falling over my keyboard, pretending I don't hear the soft sound of breathing that isn't my own, pretending that maybe, just maybe, if I ignore it long enough, it will go away. But I know better now. It will never go away. It will always be there, watching, waiting, and someday, when I least expect it, it will do more than just watch. If you ever wake up to find a stranger at the foot of your bed, don't blink, don't look away, and whatever you do, don't close your eyes, because once it knows you've seen it, it will never leave you alone, and who knows? Maybe it's watching you right now, just beyond the edge of your vision. Why don't you turn around and see? The muddy footprints on my porch weren't there when I let the dog out, but they were there when I went to let him back in, leading right to my front door. I'd been home alone for the past week while my husband, Mark, was away on a business trip. Our German Shepherd, Maxie, had been my constant companion, his presence a comfort in the empty house. We'd fallen into a routine, work during the day, dinner and TV in the evening, and a final trip outside for Max before bed. That night had started like any other. I was curled up on the couch, half watching some reality show while scrolling through my phone. Max's whine at the back door signaled it was time for his nightly outing. "All right, buddy," I said, getting up with a stretch. "Let's make this quick. It's cold out there." I opened the door and Max bounded out into the backyard, disappearing into the darkness beyond the porch light's reach. I stood there for a moment, shivering in the chilly night air, waiting for the familiar sound of him doing his business. Instead, I heard a growl, low and menacing. It was a sound I'd never heard Max make before. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. "Max," I called out, peering into the darkness. "What is it, boy?" The growling intensified, and I could hear Max's paws scrabbling against the ground, as if he was backing up. Something was wrong. Without thinking, I stepped off the porch, straining my eyes to see what had Max so agitated. That's when I heard it, a rustling in the bushes at the far end of the yard, too loud to be caused by the wind. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Is someone there?" No response, just more rustling. Max's growls had turned into frantic barking now. Fear gripped me as I realized how exposed I was, standing there in the dark. I whistled for Max and quickly retreated inside, slamming and locking the door behind me. Max came bounding up to the porch a moment later, scratching at the door to be let in. I opened it just enough to let him squeeze through, then quickly shut and locked it again. Max was agitated, pacing back and forth, his eyes fixed on the back door. I knelt down beside him, running my hands through his fur, as much to calm myself as him. "What was it, boy?" I murmured. "What did you see out there?" As if in response, Max let out another low growl, his eyes never leaving the door. I spent the next hour checking and rechecking all the locks, drawing all the curtains, and trying to convince myself that it was probably just a raccoon or a stray cat that had spooked Max. But deep down, I knew it was something more. Max wasn't the type to be scared by small animals. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear. and I decided to try and get some sleep. I made sure Max was in the bedroom with me, taking comfort in his solid presence at the foot of the bed. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by Max's barking. Harsh, frantic barks that had him leaping off the bed and racing downstairs. Heart pounding, I followed him, flicking on lights as I went. Max was at the front door, barking furiously, his hackles raised. "What is it, Max?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What do you hear?" I approached the door cautiously, straining my ears. At first, I heard nothing over Max's barking. Then, as he paused to take a breath, I heard it. A soft, scratching sound, like fingernails dragging slowly across the wood. My blood ran cold. Someone or something was out there, trying to get in. I backed away from the door, fumbling for my phone to call 911. But as I unlocked the screen, movement outside the window caught my eye. A shadow passed by too quickly for me to make out any details, but it was big, much bigger than a person should be. Max's barking reached a fever pitch. He threw himself at the door, claws scrabbling against the wood. "Max, no!" I shouted, terrified he might actually break through and confront whatever was out there. The scratching at the door stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a thud so heavy it shook the entire house. Another. Something was trying to break down the door. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed the biggest knife I could find, and retreated upstairs, dragging a still barking Max with me. I locked us in the bedroom, pushed a dresser in front of the door, and called 911 with shaking hands. 911, what's your emergency?" "There's someone trying to break into my house," I gasped. "Please, send help. I think they're going to get in." The operator tried to keep me calm, assuring me that police were on their way. But as I huddled there, listening to the continued thuds from downstairs, I wasn't sure they'd get here in time. The noises stopped abruptly. Silence fell, broken only by Max's low growls. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound of movement. Minutes ticked by. Nothing. Had they given up? Left? Then, a new sound. Footsteps. Inside the house. Heavy, slow, deliberate footsteps coming up the stairs. Max went berserk, throwing himself at the bedroom door, barking and snarling. I gripped the knife so hard my knuckles turned white, eyes fixed on the door, waiting for the inevitable attempt to break through. But it never came. The footsteps stopped right outside the bedroom. I could hear breathing, deep and ragged, like some great beast panting after a long chase. "Go away!" I screamed, my voice cracking with terror. "The police are coming. Leave us alone." A low chuckle came from the other side of the door. Not a human laugh, but something that mimicked one, as if it had heard laughter before but never quite understood it. Then it spoke. The voice was deep, guttural, more animal than human. But the words were clear. "Let me in, little one. I just want to play." I screamed then, a sound of pure, primal terror. Max's barking reached new heights of frenzy. And then, blessed sound of sirens in the distance, growing closer. The thing on the other side of the door let out a sound, half roar, half howl, that shook the windows. Then, the footsteps again, moving quickly now, down the stairs and out of the house. By the time the police arrived, the house was empty save for Max and me. They found the front door splintered and hanging off its hinges, claw marks gouged deep into the wood. And there, on the porch and leading up to the door, were a set of footprints. Huge, misshapen footprints pressed into mud that hadn't been there earlier in the evening. They searched the area, but found nothing. No signs of the intruder, no evidence beyond those footprints and the damaged door. They took my statement on, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. They clearly thought it was just a failed burglary attempt. My description of the creature dismissed as the product of fear and an overactive imagination. But I know what I heard. I know what was out there. In the days that followed, I had the locks changed, installed a security system, even considered moving. But deep down, I knew none of that would matter. Whatever had come for me that night wasn't deterred by locks or alarms. Mark came home, concerned by my jumpy behavior and the new security measures. I told him everything, expecting disbelief, but he just listened quietly, then held me close. "I believe you," he said simply. And somehow, that made it both better and worse. We still live in that house. Max still sleeps at the foot of our bed. But things have changed. I don't let him out alone at night anymore. I check and recheck the locks obsessively. And every night, as darkness falls, I find myself listening, waiting, because I know it's still out there, watching, waiting for another chance to get in. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear that voice again carried on the breeze. "Let me in, little one. I just want to play." So if you ever hear your dog barking at nothing in the night, or see muddy footprints where there shouldn't be any, remember my story. And whatever you do, don't open the door. Because some things, once invited in, never truly leave. The nanny cam footage showed a dark figure standing over my daughter's bed, but when I burst into her room, there was no one there. It all started when Lily, my 5-year-old, began talking about the shadow man who visited her at night. At first, I dismissed it as a typical childhood imagination, maybe influenced by a scary movie or book. But as the weeks went by, her stories became more detailed and consistent. "He's tall," she'd say, her big blue eyes wide with a mix of fear and fascination. "And he doesn't have a face. He just stands there and watches me." My wife, Sarah, was more concerned than I was. "Maybe we should take her to a child psychologist," she suggested one night after we'd put Lily to bed. "This doesn't seem normal." I shook my head. "Kids have imaginary friends all the time. This is probably just a phase." But deep down, I was starting to worry too. Lily had always been an imaginative child, but this was different. There was a consistency to her stories that unsettled me. And sometimes, when she talked about the shadow man, I could swear the temperature in the room dropped a few degrees. It was Sarah's idea to install the nanny cam. "Just to give us peace of mind," she said. I agreed, more to appease her than anything else. We set it up discreetly in the corner of Lily's room, its lens trained on her bed. For the first few nights, nothing happened. The footage showed Lily sleeping peacefully, occasionally tossing or turning, but nothing out of the ordinary. I was just starting to feel silly for even considering that there might be something to her stories when it happened. It was a Tuesday night. Sarah was working late, and I was alone in the house with Lily. I'd just settled down to watch some TV after putting her to bed when my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the nanny cam. I opened the app, expecting to see Lily getting up for a glass of water or to use the bathroom. Instead, what I saw made my blood run cold. There, at the foot of Lily's bed, was a tall, dark figure. It was just as she had described, unnaturally tall, with long, spindly limbs and no discernible face. It stood perfectly still, seeming to look down at my sleeping daughter. I was on my feet and running up the stairs before I even realized I was moving. I burst into Lily's room, flicking on the light switch and ready to confront whatever was in there. But the room was empty. Lily was fast asleep in her bed, undisturbed. There was no sign of any intruder, no open windows or doors. I checked every corner, even looked under the bed and in the closet. Nothing. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and rewatched the footage. There it was, clear as day. The dark figure standing motionless by the bed. As I watched, it slowly turned its head towards the camera, revealing a blank, featureless face. Then, just before I entered the room, it simply vanished. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in Lily's room, watching her sleep, jumping at every shadow and creak. When Sarah got home, I showed her the footage. She went pale, her hands covering her mouth in shock. "We need to get Lily out of here," she whispered. "We can go stay with my parents until we figure this out." I nodded, too shaken to argue. We woke Lily up and packed a few bags, telling her we were going on a surprise trip to Grandma and Grandpa's house. She was sleepy but excited, chattering about the Shadow Man as we drove through the dark, empty streets. "He said he'd find me," she said from the back seat, her voice a mix of excitement and fear. "He said we're connected now." Sarah and I exchanged a worried glance, but said nothing. We spent a week at my in-laws' house. Lily seemed happier there, and there were no more incidents or stories about the Shadow Man. We started to relax, to think that maybe it had all been some kind of bizarre glitch with the camera, but when we returned home, it started again. This time, it wasn't just Lily seeing things. Sarah woke me up one night, her face pale with fear. "There's someone in the hallway," she whispered. "I saw a shadow move past our door." I got up to check, my heart pounding. The hallway was empty, but as I stood there, I felt an unmistakable chill, as if someone, or something, had just passed by. We called in every expert we could think of: paranormal investigators, priests, even a team of scientists with EMF detectors and infrared cameras. They all found nothing. No evidence of any supernatural activity, no rational explanation for what we were experiencing. But the sightings continued. The nanny cam caught more footage of the figure, always standing over Lily's bed, always vanishing the moment we entered the room. We started seeing it ourselves, a tall, dark shape at the edge of our vision, gone when we turned to look directly at it. Lily, strangely, seemed less afraid than we were. "He's not bad," she insisted. "He's just lonely. He wants a friend." Her words did little to comfort us. Whatever this thing was, it was fixated on our daughter, and that terrified us more than anything. We tried moving to a new house, but it followed us. We took Lily to specialists, but they found nothing wrong with her. We even considered more drastic measures, like reaching out to mediums or exorcists, but something always held us back. A fear that acknowledging this thing, giving it more attention, would only make it stronger. Months passed, and slowly we began to adapt to our new reality. The sightings became less frequent, or maybe we just got used to them. We learned to live with the constant feeling of being watched, the occasional glimpse of a dark figure in the corner of our eye. Lily grew older, and her attitude towards the Shadow Man changed. She stopped talking about him as much, and when she did, it was with a mixture of annoyance and resignation, like he was an unwelcome but persistent guest. "He's still here," she told me on her 10th birthday, her voice low so Sarah couldn't hear. "But he doesn't scare me anymore. I think he's afraid of me now." I didn't know how to respond to that. Part of me was relieved that she wasn't frightened, but another part worried about what it meant. Had she truly outgrown her fear, or had something fundamentally changed in her? As the years went by, the Shadow Man became a sort of family secret. We never talked about it outside the house, never mentioned it to friends or relatives, but we all knew it was there, a constant presence in our lives. Sometimes, late at night, I'd catch Sarah staring into the darkness of our room, her eyes tracking something I couldn't see. Other times, I'd walk past Lily's room and hear her talking softly, as if in conversation with someone. We learned to live with it, but we never accepted it. Every night as I lay in bed, I'd wonder, what is it? Why is it here? What does it want with my daughter? And every night, as I drifted off to sleep, I'd feel that familiar chill, that sense of being watched, and I'd know, with absolute certainty, that it was still there, still watching, still waiting. Now, as I write this, Lily is about to leave for college. She's grown into a strong, confident young woman, seemingly unaffected by the strange experiences of her childhood. But sometimes, when she thinks no one is looking, I catch her glancing over her shoulder, her eyes scanning empty spaces. The Shadow Man hasn't appeared on camera in years, but I know he's still here. I can feel him, a constant presence in our home. And as Lily prepares to leave, I find myself wondering, will he follow her, or will he stay here with us, a silent, unseen member of our family? I don't have answers. I don't know if I ever will. But I do know this. Sometimes, the things we can't see are the most real. And sometimes, the shadows in our lives are more than just absence of light. They're presences, watching, waiting, and maybe, in their own way, protecting. So if your child ever tells you about a shadow in their room, listen. Really listen. Because you never know what might be lurking just beyond the edge of your vision, in the spaces between what's real and what's imagined. And remember, not all monsters are there to harm. Some are just there, watching, waiting. For what? We may never know. The forest had eyes, and they were all fixed on me. I'd been hiking for hours, pushing myself to reach the summit before nightfall. But as the sun dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows across the unfamiliar trail, I realized I'd made a terrible mistake. The map I'd so confidently memorized that morning now seemed like a cruel joke, each bend in the path leading me further from my intended destination. The first tendrils of panic began to creep in as darkness fell. The chirping of birds gave way to the eerie hoots of owls and the rustling of unseen creatures in the underbrush. My headlamp, once a beacon of security, now only served to create grotesque shadows that danced at the edge of my vision. I stumbled on, my legs aching and my breath coming in ragged gasps. The cool mountain air that had been so refreshing earlier now chilled me to the bone. I pulled my jacket tighter, wishing I'd packed more than a light windbreaker and a few granola bars. Just as I was about to give up hope and resign myself to a night huddled beneath a tree, I saw it. A flicker of light in the distance, steady and warm. A cabin. Relief flooded through me, temporarily washing away my exhaustion. I pushed forward with renewed energy, my eyes fixed on that promise of shelter. As I drew closer, details began to emerge. It was a small, rustic structure, the kind you might expect to find deep in the wilderness. The windows were dark save for one, which emitted a soft, flickering glow. Candlelight, perhaps. I approached cautiously, suddenly aware that I was about to intrude on someone's private space. But surely, I reasoned, anyone living this far out in the woods would understand the plight of a lost hiker. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. No response. I tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. I climbed the creaky wooden steps to the porch, leaves crunching beneath my feet. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and I winced at each sound. I raised my hand to knock on the door, but something made me hesitate. A feeling, deep in my gut, that something wasn't quite right. I pushed the feeling aside and rapped my knuckles against the weathered wood. The sound echoed hollowly, and I realized the door wasn't fully closed. It swung open slightly at my touch, revealing a sliver of the interior. "Hello?" I called again, softer this time. "I'm sorry to intrude, but I'm lost. I was hoping I could use your phone, or maybe get directions." Silence greeted me. The rational part of my brain told me to turn around, to take my chances in the woods rather than enter a stranger's home uninvited. But exhaustion and desperation won out. I pushed the door open wider and stepped inside. The cabin was sparsely furnished, with a small kitchenette to my left and a living area directly ahead. A fire burned low in a stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls. It looked cozy, lived in. But there was something off about it that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I moved further into the room, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. That's when I noticed the first oddity. The walls were covered in photographs, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, overlapping and haphazardly tacked up. In the flickering firelight, it took me a moment to realize what I was seeing. They were all pictures of people hiking, Men, women, young, old. A diverse array of smiling faces posing on trails, next to waterfalls, atop mountain peaks. But as I looked closer, my blood ran cold. In each photo, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, was a dark figure lurking in the background, sometimes partially hidden behind a tree, sometimes a mere shadow at the edge of the frame, but always there, always watching. I stumbled back, my heart racing. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I turned to leave, but something on the kitchen counter caught my eye. A pile of wallets and cell phones, some looking new, others weather-worn and aged. With trembling hands, I picked up the nearest phone and pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life, revealing a lock screen photo of a young woman smiling brightly. The date in the corner read, May 15th, 2021, over 2 years ago. A floorboard creaked behind me. I whirled around, dropping the phone in my panic. There, silhouetted in the doorway of what I assumed was a bedroom, stood a figure. Tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching me with eyes that reflected the firelight like an animal's. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, slowly, deliberately, it took a step forward. I ran. I burst out of the cabin, nearly falling down the porch steps in my haste. I didn't look back, didn't slow down. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face and arms. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but terror kept me moving. I don't know how long I ran. It could have been minutes or hours. All I know is that eventually, I collapsed, my body simply unable to go any further. I lay there on the forest floor, gasping for air, leaves and twigs digging into my skin. As my panic slowly subsided, replaced by bone-deep exhaustion, I became aware of my surroundings again. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No owls, no rustling leaves, no scurrying creatures, just an oppressive, unnatural silence. I pushed myself up to a sitting position, wincing at the various aches and pains making themselves known. My headlamp had been lost somewhere in my frantic flight, leaving me in near total darkness. The trees loomed around me, their branches reaching out like grasping fingers. I fumbled for my phone, praying for a signal, for some way to call for help. The screen lit up, momentarily blinding me. No service, of course. But as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. The wallpaper on my phone had changed. Instead of the default nature scene I usually had, it now showed a photo of me, taken from behind as I hiked earlier that day. And there, in the background, barely visible among the trees, was a dark, elongated figure. I dropped the phone as if it had burned me, scrambling backward until my back hit a tree. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't possible. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to wake up from this nightmare. When I opened them again, nothing had changed. The dark forest still surrounded me, filled with unseen threats. And now, in the distance, I could hear something. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. I wanted to run again, but my body refused to cooperate. I was spent, utterly drained. All I could do was press myself against the tree and pray that whatever was out there wouldn't find me. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied now by the sound of branches snapping. It was close, so close. I held my breath, trying to make myself as small and quiet as possible. A twig snapped right next to me. I looked up, my eyes straining in the darkness. At first, I saw nothing. Then, slowly, a shape began to resolve itself. Tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch and bend in ways that defied anatomy. Its face, if you could call it that, was featureless save for two gleaming points of light where eyes should be. It stood there, motionless, staring down at me. I waited for it to attack, to finish what it had started back at the cabin. but it didn't move. It just watched. After what felt like an eternity, it slowly raised one long, spindly arm. In its hand, it held something out to me. My headlamp. With shaking hands, I reached out and took it. The moment my fingers touched the plastic, the creature vanished. 1 second it was there, the next, gone, as if it had never existed. I sat there for a long time, clutching my headlamp like a lifeline, too scared to move, too tired to think. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I finally found the strength to stand. I walked for hours, my legs moving mechanically, my mind a blank. When I finally emerged from the tree line onto a paved road, I felt no relief. Just a deep, lingering sense of wrongness that I knew would never fully leave me. A passing motorist eventually picked me up, concerned by my disheveled appearance and vacant stare. They took me to the nearest ranger station, where I mumbled something about getting lost. I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth. Who would believe me? As I sat in the warm, brightly lit station, waiting for my emergency contact to arrive, I caught a glimpse of movement outside the window. Just for a second, I saw it. A tall, dark figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me with gleaming eyes. I blinked, and it was gone. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that it wasn't over. Whatever I had encountered in those woods, whatever lived in that cabin, it wasn't done with me. And someday, somehow, I would have to face it again. The engine sputtered one last time before dying completely, leaving us stranded in a sea of darkness. As the headlights flickered and faded, I caught a glimpse of something moving just beyond their reach. Sarah and I had been driving for hours, making our way back from her parents' and house in the countryside. It was supposed to be a simple 4-hour drive, but a detour due to road construction had led us onto this lonely stretch of highway. We hadn't seen another car for at least an hour when our trusty old sedan decided it had had enough. "This can't be happening," Sarah muttered, frantically turning the key in the ignition. The engine wheezed pathetically, but refused to turn over. "Do we have any cell service out here?" I pulled out my phone, already knowing the answer. "No bars," I confirmed, trying to keep the worry out of my voice. "But it's okay. Someone's bound to drive by eventually, right?" Sarah nodded, but I could see the fear in her eyes. We were both city kids, unused to the oppressive darkness of the countryside at night. The moon was a mere sliver in the sky, providing little illumination to the vast emptiness surrounding us. "Maybe we should try to flag someone down," I suggested, unbuckling my seatbelt. "I've got a flashlight in the trunk. We could take turns standing by the road." Sarah grabbed my arm as I reached for the door handle. "Wait," she whispered, her eyes wide. "Did you see that?" I followed her gaze out the passenger side window. At first, I saw nothing but inky blackness. Then, a movement caught my eye. Something large shifted in the shadows just beyond the reach of our dying headlights. "It's probably just a deer," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. But as I watched, I realized the shape was all wrong for a deer. It was too tall, too human-like. We sat in tense silence, straining our eyes against the darkness. The shape moved again, and this time, I was certain, it was bipedal, walking on 2 legs with an odd, loping gait. "That's not a deer," Sarah breathed, her grip on my arm tightening. Before I could respond, we heard it, a low, guttural sound that was neither human nor animal. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, surrounding the car. "Lock the doors," I hissed, fumbling for the central locking button. The click of the locks engaging was somehow both reassuring and terrifying, a thin barrier between us and whatever was out there. The sound came again, closer this time, And now there was more than one, two, three, maybe more voices joining in a discordant chorus that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "What do we do?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. I tried to think rationally. We were safer in the car than outside, but for how long? Our phones were useless. The car wouldn't start. And who knew when another vehicle might pass by? And even if one did, would they stop on this dark, deserted road? A thud against the side of the car made us both jump. Something had struck the metal, hard enough to rock the vehicle slightly. "Oh God," Sarah whimpered, pulling her feet up onto the seat and hugging her knees to her chest. I reached across to hold her, my eyes never leaving the windows. The shapes were moving more now, circling the car. I could make out vague humanoid forms, but there was something off about their proportions. Limbs too long, heads misshapen. Another thud, this time on the roof. Claws, or were they fingers, scraped across the metal, the sound setting my teeth on edge. "We can't stay here," I said, trying to keep my voice low and calm. "We need to make a run for it." Sarah looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Are you crazy? We can't go out there." "If we stay, they'll find a way in eventually," I reasoned. "Our only chance is to make it to those trees." I pointed to a dark line on the horizon that I hoped was a forest. "We can lose them in there. Find somewhere to hide until morning." Sarah shook her head vehemently. "No, no way. We don't even know what those things are." As if in response to her words, one of the creatures slammed into the driver's side window. For a split second, I saw its face pressed against the glass, a twisted parody of humanity with two large eyes and a mouth full of needle-like teeth. Sarah screamed, and I made a split-second decision. "We're going, now." I grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment and took Sarah's hand. "When I say go, we run. Don't look back, don't stop. Just run for the trees, okay?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face, but a look of determination in her eyes. I took a deep breath, my hand on the door handle. 1, 2, 3, go. I flung the door open and we burst out of the car. Immediately, inhuman shrieks filled the air. I clicked on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness and revealing our path. We ran, our feet pounding against the asphalt. I could hear them behind us, their odd loping gait somehow allowing them to gain on us quickly. The trees seemed impossibly far away. Something grabbed at my jacket and I stumbled, nearly falling. Sarah's grip on my hand tightened, pulling me forward. "Don't stop," she yelled. I regained my footing and we pressed on. The creatures were all around us now, darting in and out of the flashlight's beam. I caught glimpses of pale, elongated limbs and glowing eyes. Just as I thought we couldn't run any farther, we reached the tree line. We plunged into the forest, branches whipping at our faces as we crashed through the underbrush. The sounds of pursuit seemed to falter as we entered the woods. Did they not like the trees? I didn't waste time wondering why, just grateful for any advantage. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like lead. Finally, I spotted a large fallen tree, its roots creating a small cave-like space. "Here," I gasped, pulling Sarah towards it. We crawled into the space, huddling together in the damp earth. I clicked off the flashlight, plunging us into darkness. For a long time, the only sound was our ragged breathing and the frantic beating of our hearts. Gradually, other noises began to filter in. The rustle of leaves in the wind, the hoot of an owl. Normal, natural sounds that slowly began to ease the terror gripping my chest. "Do you think we lost them?" Sarah whispered after what felt like hours. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of our pursuers. "I think so," I said cautiously. "But let's wait until dawn, just to be sure." Sarah nodded, settling against me. We sat in silence, jumping at every snapping twig or rustling bush. But nothing came for us. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, we cautiously emerged from our hiding place. The forest looked different in the daylight, less menacing, more mundane. We made our way back to the road, half expecting to see those creatures waiting for us. But there was nothing, just our abandoned car sitting exactly where we'd left it. A truck driver found us a couple hours later, walking along the side of the road. He was kind enough to give us a ride to the nearest town, where we were able to call for help and get our car towed. We never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. Who would believe us? Sometimes, I almost convinced myself it was all a shared hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. Almost. But on dark nights, when the wind whispers through the trees and shadows seem to move of their own accord, I remember the inhuman shrieks, the glowing eyes, the twisted faces, and I wonder, are they still out there, waiting in the darkness beyond the headlights, waiting for another stranded traveler, another chance to hunt? I don't drive on lonely country roads at night anymore, and if I ever find myself on one, I keep my eyes fixed firmly ahead, because I know now what lurks in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the light. And some things, once seen, can never be unseen. So if you're ever driving late at night and your car breaks down on a deserted stretch of road, remember our story. And whatever you do, don't look into the darkness, because sometimes the darkness looks back. The footsteps behind me weren't my echo. I realized this with a sickening certainty as I took an unexpected turn down a narrow alley, and they followed without missing a beat. It was supposed to be a normal Friday night. I'd stayed late at the office, rushing to finish a project before the weekend. By the time I left, the streets were nearly empty, the usual bustle of the city replaced by an eerie quiet. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, I'd walked this route home countless times before. The first inkling that something was off came about 10 minutes into my walk, a prickle on the back of my neck, that age-old instinct warning of unseen eyes. I glanced over my shoulder, but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just empty sidewalks and the occasional passing car. I picked up my pace slightly, telling myself I was being paranoid, but the feeling persisted, growing stronger with each block. That's when I first noticed the footsteps. At first, I thought it was just my own echoing off the buildings. But as I varied my speed, slowing down then speeding up, I realized the footsteps behind me weren't matching my rhythm. They were steady, relentless, always the same distance behind me. My heart began to race. I fumbled for my phone, intending to call a friend, anyone. But my trembling fingers betrayed me, and the device clattered to the sidewalk. As I bent to retrieve it, I caught a glimpse of a figure reflected in the dark screen. Tall, shadowy, much closer than I'd thought. I abandoned the phone, breaking into a run. The footsteps behind me quickened to match. Panic clouded my thoughts as I sprinted down the familiar streets, now rendered strange and threatening by the darkness and my fear. I turned randomly, hoping to lose my pursuer in the maze of side streets and alleys. But no matter how many turns I took, no matter how fast I ran, the footsteps remained. Sometimes they seemed to fade, only to return moments later, closer than ever. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare stop. I no longer knew where I was, having long since left my usual route home. The buildings loomed over me, their windows dark and lifeless. No one to help, no one to hear me if I screamed. As I rounded another corner, I saw Salvation, a 24-hour convenience store, its fluorescent lights a beacon in the darkness. I put on a final burst of speed, practically throwing myself through the door. The bored-looking clerk glanced up from his phone, startled by my abrupt entrance. "You okay, miss?" I couldn't speak, could barely breathe. I just shook my head, gesturing frantically towards the door. The clerk's eyes widened as he looked past me. "There's no one there." I spun around, half expecting to see my pursuer looming in the doorway, but the street outside was empty. No shadowy figure, no ominous footsteps. Just the quiet night and my own ragged breathing. There was someone following me. I managed to gasp out. The clerk looked skeptical, but he was kind enough to let me use the store's phone to call a cab. As I waited, huddled by the counter and jumping at every sound, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Had I imagined it all? Was it just paranoia and an overactive imagination, fueled by too many late nights and too much coffee? But no, I couldn't have imagined those footsteps, that relentless pursuit. It had been real, terrifyingly, undeniably real. The cab arrived, and I practically dove into the back seat, giving the driver my address in a shaky voice. As we pulled away from the curb, I allowed myself to relax slightly. I was safe now. Whatever, whoever, had been following me was gone. But as we stopped at a red light, I glanced out the window and felt my blood turn to ice. There, on the sidewalk, was a figure, tall, indistinct in the shadows, but unmistakably the same presence I'd felt behind me all night. And it was looking directly at me. I blinked and it was gone. Just an empty sidewalk, no different from any other in the city. But I knew what I'd seen. The rest of the ride passed in a blur. I kept my eyes fixed firmly ahead, afraid of what I might see if I looked out the windows again. When we finally reached my apartment building, I threw some money at the driver and ran inside, not stopping until I was safely in my unit, door locked and chained behind me. I spent the rest of the night huddled on my couch, lights blazing and TV on for company. Sleep was out of the question. Every creak of the building, every distant siren had me jumping, convinced my pursuer had somehow found me. As dawn broke, casting a pale light through my windows, I began to doubt myself again. In the harsh light of day, last night's terror seemed almost laughable. I must have let my imagination run wild, turning ordinary noises into a nightmare pursuit. I managed to doze off for a few hours, exhaustion finally overcoming fear. When I woke, it was early afternoon. The events of the previous night felt like a distant dream. I showered, ate, tried to go about my day normally, but I couldn't shake the lingering unease, the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in my world. As evening approached, I found myself dreading the coming darkness. I knew it was irrational, but I couldn't bear the thought of being outside after sunset. I ordered delivery for dinner, double-checked all my locks, and settled in for another night of sleepless vigilance. It was just past midnight when I heard it, a soft scraping sound, coming from my front door. I froze, remote control slipping from my suddenly numb fingers. It came again, louder this time. Something was out there, trying to get in. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but fear had robbed me of my voice. I could only watch in mute horror as the doorknob began to turn. Slowly, slowly. The chain caught, the door opening just a crack, and in that narrow space, I saw an eye. Not a human eye, but something alien, ancient, filled with a hunger that made my soul shrivel. I don't remember much after that. Somehow, I managed to slam the door shut, to wedge a chair under the knob. I remember calling 911, babbling about intruders and stalkers, but by the time the police arrived, there was no sign of anyone having been at my door. No scratches, no fingerprints, nothing. They were kind, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. Just another paranoid city dweller, jumping at shadows. They promised to keep an eye on the building, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever was after me, it wasn't something the police could stop. I moved out of that apartment the next day, fled the city entirely. I told myself it was just stress, that I needed a change of scenery. But deep down, I knew I was running. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that it wouldn't be enough. Because sometimes, late at night, I still hear those footsteps. Steady, relentless, always the same distance behind me. I've learned not to look back, not to acknowledge them, But they're there, always there. And someday, I know, they'll catch up to me, so I keep moving, never staying in one place too long. I avoid dark streets and empty sidewalks. I never walk alone at night. But still, I feel those eyes on me. Still, I hear those footsteps. And I wonder, in my darkest moments, if they were ever really behind me at all. Or if, perhaps, they've been inside me all along, patiently waiting for the moment when I can no longer outrun my own shadows. The attic door wasn't supposed to be open. I froze at the top of the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The sliver of darkness peeking through the gap seemed to taunt me, daring me to investigate. I'd been house-sitting for the Andersons for 3 days now, and I was certain I'd never seen that door open before. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty hallway. No response, just the faint creaking of the old house settling around me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. It's probably nothing, I told myself. Maybe the door just wasn't latched properly and had swung open on its own. I glanced at my phone. 11:47 p.m. Way too late to be dealing with this, but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep if I didn't check it out. I grabbed the nearest weapon-like object I could find, a heavy brass candlestick from the hallway table, and slowly approached the attic door. The floorboards creaked under my feet, each step feeling like an eternity. As I got closer, I noticed something odd about the gap in the doorway. It wasn't just darkness I was seeing. There was movement. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. Like something was shifting just out of sight. My palms were sweaty on the candlestick as I reached for the door handle. I hesitated for a moment, then steeled myself and pulled it open in one quick motion. The hinges groaned, and a wave of musty air washed over me. I fumbled for the light switch, my fingers trembling. Click. Nothing happened. Of course the bulb would be burnt out. Just my luck. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the attic. Dust motes danced in the light, stirred up by the open door. Old furniture and boxes cast long shadows, creating a maze of dark shapes. Everything looked normal, exactly as it should in a rarely used attic space. But then I heard it, a soft thump, like something being set down carefully, coming from the far corner of the room. "Is someone there?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. "I'm armed, and I've called the police." A lie, but hopefully convincing enough to scare off any intruder. No response. Just another soft thump. Closer this time. I took a tentative step into the attic, my phone held out in front of me like a shield. The beam of light darted from shadow to shadow, revealing nothing but more dusty storage. My heart was racing so fast I could feel it in my throat. Another thump, definitely closer, and then whispers. So faint I almost thought I was imagining it, but unmistakably there. A low, rapid muttering in a language I couldn't understand. I spun around, trying to locate the source of the sound. "Who's there? Show yourself." The whispering stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then, a floorboard creaked directly behind me. I whirled around, swinging the candlestick wildly. It connected with something solid, and I heard a muffled grunt of pain. My phone clattered to the floor, the light spinning crazily across the room. In the flashing beam, I caught glimpses of a figure, tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over sharp bones. And its eyes, God, its eyes were huge, black, and utterly inhuman. I screamed and stumbled backward, tripping over a box and falling hard. The creature loomed over me, its mouth opening to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. The whispering started again, louder now, filling my head with its alien cadence. I scrambled to my feet and ran for the door, not daring to look back. I could hear it moving behind me, its footsteps unnaturally quick and light. I slammed the attic door shut and fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage it. Just as the lock clicked into place, something heavy thudded against the other side of the door. The wood bulged outward, as if struck by a battering ram. I stumbled back, watching in horror as the door shuddered under repeated blows. I turned and fled down the stairs, taking them two at a time. I could hear the attic door splintering behind me, the creature's inhuman shrieks echoing through the house. I ran for the front door, yanking it open and bursting out into the cool night air. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, parked at the curb. I fumbled with my keys, glancing back at the house. There, in the upstairs window, I saw a pale face watching me. Those black eyes locked onto mine for a moment, and then it was gone, melting back into the shadows. I got my car started and peeled away from the curb, tires squealing. I drove aimlessly for hours, too terrified to go back to my own apartment. What if it followed me? What if there were more of them? As the adrenaline wore off, I began to doubt myself. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Maybe it was just an oddly shaped shadow, my imagination running wild in the dark. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had seen something in that attic, something that shouldn't exist. I finally pulled into a 24-hour diner parking lot as the sun was starting to rise. My hands were still shaking as I took out my phone to call the Andersons. How was I going to explain this to them? As I scrolled through my contacts, a text message popped up. It was from an unknown number, sent just a few minutes ago. My blood ran cold as I read it. "We're waiting for you. Come back soon." Attached was a photo of the inside of my apartment. In the corner, barely visible, was a tall, thin silhouette with glowing eyes. I dropped my phone, my mind reeling. They knew where I lived. They were in my home. Where could I go? What could I do? As panic threatened to overwhelm me, I forced myself to think rationally. I needed help, but who would believe me? The police. They'd think I was crazy or on drugs. My friends would probably react the same way. I sat in my car for a long time, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. The diner started to fill up with the breakfast crowd, normal people going about their normal lives. They had no idea about the horrors that lurked in the shadows, the things that defied explanation. Finally, I made a decision. I couldn't run forever, and I couldn't let these things terrorize others. I had to go back, to face whatever was waiting for me. But I wouldn't go unprepared. I drove to the nearest hardware store and bought everything I thought might be useful: flashlights, batteries, a heavy-duty padlock, and, yes, even some religious symbols. I didn't know if they would work, but I figured it couldn't hurt. As I loaded my purchases into the car, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. A tall, thin figure standing across the street, partially hidden behind a tree. I blinked, and it was gone, but I knew it had been there, watching me. I took a deep breath and started the car. It was time to go back to the Andersons' house, time to face whatever was waiting in that attic. I didn't know if I would survive the encounter, but I knew I had to try, because if I didn't, who would? How many others might fall victim to these creatures? As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide a lurking threat. Every unexpected movement made me flinch. But beneath the fear, a steely determination was growing. I may not have asked for this, but I was the one who had seen them, the one who knew they existed, and that made it my responsibility to do something about it. I pulled up in front of the Andersons' house, my car loaded with makeshift weapons and defenses. The house looked perfectly normal in the bright sunlight, but I knew the evil that lurked inside. As I got out of the car, I saw movement in the attic window. A pale face, those black eyes staring down at me. It knew I was here. It was waiting for me. I grabbed my supplies and walked towards the front door, my heart pounding but my resolve firm. Whatever happened next, I was done running. It was time to face the darkness, to shine a light on the horrors hiding in the shadows. I put the key in the lock and turned it, the click seeming impossibly loud in the quiet suburban street. As I pushed the door open, I heard that familiar whisper start up again, coming from upstairs. "I'm here," I called out, my voice steady despite my fear. "Let's finish this." I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. Whatever waited for me in that attic, I was ready to face it. The real horror, I realized, wasn't the unknown creatures lurking in the dark. It was the thought of letting them continue to exist unchallenged, free to terrorize others. As I climbed the stairs, candlestick in one hand and flashlight in the other, I knew one thing for certain. After tonight, nothing would ever be the same again. The headlights behind me hadn't blinked for the last 20 miles. At first, I thought it was just another late-night traveler on the lonely stretch of highway. But as I took turn after turn, the persistent glow in my rearview mirror began to feel less like coincidence and more like pursuit. I'd left work later than usual, the hands of the clock creeping past midnight by the time I finally shut down my computer. The office had been empty, save for the quiet hum of the cleaning crew's vacuum in the distance. I remember thinking how nice it would be to crawl into bed, to let the stress of the day melt away. Now, as I gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled hands, sleep was the furthest thing from my mind. The car behind me was nondescript, a sedan, dark in color, though the exact shade was impossible to determine in the inky blackness of the night. Its high beams cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead of me almost as clearly as my own headlights. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe they were just heading in the same direction. Maybe they were lost and following me in hopes I'd lead them to civilization. But each explanation felt flimsier than the last, especially as I deviated from my usual route home. Left turn onto Maple Street. The car followed, right onto Oak Avenue. Still there. A quick jog onto a side street I'd never taken before. The headlights remained steadfast in my mirror. My heart raced, pounding so loudly I could hear it over the radio I'd turned on in a futile attempt to calm my nerves. I reached for my phone, intending to call 911, but hesitated. What would I say? "Hello, officer. A car is driving behind me." They'd laugh me off the line. I decided to test my pursuer. There was a 24-hour grocery store about a mile ahead. I'd pull in there, park, and see what they did. If they followed me in, I could run inside where there were people and cameras. If they drove past, well, then I'd feel foolish, but at least I'd be safe. As the store's neon sign came into view, I flicked on my turn signal. The car behind me did the same. My mouth went dry. I pulled into the parking lot, choosing a spot near the front entrance. The other car slowed as it approached the turn, and for a moment I dared to hope they would continue past. But then, with agonizing deliberation, it too turned into the lot. I killed the engine, but didn't get out. Through my side mirror, I watched as the other car circled the lot once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th pass, it pulled into a spot 2 rows behind me, angled so that its headlights were aimed directly at my car. The engine cut off, but the lights remained on, bathing my car in harsh white light. I squinted, trying to make out any details of the driver, but the glare made it impossible. Minutes ticked by. Neither of us moved. The store's automatic doors slid open, and an employee stepped out for a smoke break. I saw my chance. In one fluid motion, I flung open my car door and sprinted towards the store. "Help!" I called out to the startled employee. "Someone's following me." The young man's eyes widened, and he quickly ushered me inside, locking the door behind us. "Are you okay? Should I call the police?" I nodded, grateful for his quick thinking. As he reached for the phone behind the counter, I turned to look out the large front windows. The car was gone. My pursuer had vanished as quickly and mysteriously as they had appeared. The employee, his name tag read Chris, handed me a bottle of water, and asked me to describe what happened. As I recounted the events of the last hour, doubt began to creep in. Had I overreacted? Was it all in my head? The police arrived about 15 minutes later. They took my statement, reviewed the store's security footage, which showed a dark sedan circling the lot before speeding away, and offered to escort me home. I gratefully accepted. As we pulled out of the parking lot, the officer in the lead car, me following close behind, and a second patrol car bringing up the rear, I felt safe for the first time in hours. The familiar streets of my neighborhood came into view, and I let out a sigh of relief. Home. Safety. The officers did a quick sweep of my house before giving me the all-clear. They promised to increase patrols in the area for the next few nights and left me with a card to call if I noticed anything suspicious. I locked the door behind them, double-checked every window, and finally allowed myself to relax. It was over. I was safe. As I went through my nightly routine, washing my face, brushing my teeth, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Who was in that car? What did they want? Would they be back? I crawled into bed, exhaustion finally overtaking my frayed nerves. Just as I was about to drift off, a notification chirp from my phone jolted me awake. It was a text message from an unknown number. Sweet dreams. See you tomorrow. Sleep didn't come easily that night, or any night after. The next day, I called in sick to work. I couldn't bear the thought of leaving the house, of being out on those dark roads again. I spent the day jumping at every sound, peeking through the curtains at the slightest noise outside. The police came by to follow up, but they had no leads. The security footage from the store wasn't clear enough to get a license plate number. They advised me to stay vigilant, to vary my routines, and to call immediately if I saw the car again. Days passed, then weeks. Slowly, life began to return to normal. I went back to work, though I made sure to leave before dark. I installed a security system, got to know my neighbors better, even adopted a large dog from the local shelter. But the fear never fully went away. Every time I got in my car, I found myself obsessively checking the rearview mirror. Every pair of headlights in the distance made my heart race. And then, just as I was starting to think it had all been some bizarre or isolated incident, it happened again. It was a Friday night. I'd stayed late at work again, promising myself it would be the last time. As I pulled out of the parking garage, I immediately noticed the car. Same make, same model, same dark color that seemed to absorb the light around it. This time, I didn't hesitate. I called 911 as I drove, relaying my location and the situation to the dispatcher. They told me to drive to the nearest police station, about 10 miles away. I followed their instructions, my eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. The car stayed with me, matching my every turn, every lane change. 5 miles from the station, it happened. A semi-truck pulled out in front of me, forcing me to slam on my brakes. In that moment of chaos, I lost sight of my pursuer. When I looked back, the road behind me was empty. I made it to the police station, shaken but unharmed. They took another report, promised again to look into it, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. Without any concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my phone chirped again. Another message from the unknown number. Close call tonight. Let's not cut it so close next time. I didn't sleep at all. The next day, I made a decision. I couldn't live like this anymore, jumping at shadows, afraid to leave my house. I needed answers. I hired a private investigator, someone recommended by a friend in law enforcement. I told him everything, the car, the texts, the fear that had become my constant companion. For weeks, he dug into my life, my past, looking for any connection, any reason why someone might be targeting me. And finally, he found something. It wasn't a stalker. It wasn't a random psychopath. It was much, much worse. The car belonged to a private security firm. the kind that wealthy, powerful people hire when they want something done quietly. And they had been hired by someone I thought I'd left in my past long ago. The truth, when it came out, was almost too much to bear. An old mistake, a covered-up accident, a powerful family looking for revenge. I won't go into the details. I can't, for legal reasons. But suffice it to say, my life as I knew it was over. I had a choice to make. I could run, change my name, start a new life somewhere far away. Or I could stay and fight, to clear my name and face the consequences of my past. In the end, I chose to stay. It hasn't been easy. There have been legal battles, threats, moments when I've questioned everything. But I'm still here, still fighting. And every night, as I drive home, I still check my rearview mirror. Not out of fear anymore, but as a reminder. A reminder that the past is always closer than we think. And that sometimes, the things we run from are the very things we need to face. The car hasn't appeared again, but I know it's out there, waiting. And when it comes, I'll be ready. Because now I understand. You can't outrun your past, but you can face it head on, headlights blazing in the darkness. The scratching in the wall started on the third night. At first, I dismissed it as mice, but as the sound grew louder and more insistent, I realized it was coming from places mice couldn't possibly reach. I'd been house-sitting for my parents for just over a week when the noises began. Their sprawling Victorian home, nestled in the quiet suburbs, had always felt a bit too big and a bit too old for my liking. But the promise of a quiet place to work on my thesis and raid their well-stocked fridge had been too tempting to pass up. The first 2 nights passed uneventfully. I spent my days alternating between furious typing sessions at the dining room table and mindless Netflix binges on the living room couch. The house creaked and settled around me, but it was nothing out of the ordinary for a structure pushing 100 years old. But on that third night, as I lay in bed trying to fall asleep, I heard it. A faint scratching sound, like fingernails dragging across wood. It seemed to be coming from inside the wall next to my bed. I sat up, holding my breath and straining my ears. For a moment, there was nothing. Then it came again, louder this time. I got out of bed and pressed my ear to the wall. The scratching continued, moving upwards towards the ceiling. Then, to my horror, it seemed to transfer to the ceiling itself, tracing a path directly above my head. "Hello," I called out, feeling foolish even as I did so. "Is someone there?" The scratching stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I spent the rest of the night with all the lights on, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. By morning, I had almost convinced myself it had been a dream, a product of too much late-night caffeine and an overactive imagination. But the next night, it happened again. And this time, it wasn't just scratching. I could hear something moving inside the walls, a soft shuffling punctuated by occasional thumps. It sounded big, much too big to be any kind of rodent. I called my parents, trying to keep the panic out of my voice as I casually asked if they'd ever had problems with animals getting into the walls. They assured me they hadn't, but promised to send an exterminator over in a few days, just in case. Those few days stretched on endlessly. Each night the noises grew louder, more frequent. They weren't confined to my bedroom anymore. I could hear them throughout the house, in the living room walls, the kitchen ceiling, even coming up through the floorboards in the study. I took to wandering the house at night, armed with a flashlight and my father's old baseball bat. I examined every inch of the walls, looking for holes or cracks where something could be getting in. But I found nothing. The walls were solid, unbroken expanses of plaster and wood. On the 5th night, I heard something new. A voice. It was faint, muffled by the walls, but unmistakably human. Or at least, it sounded human. The words were unclear, but the tone was pleading, desperate. "Who's there?" I shouted, pounding on the wall. "Do you need help?" The voice fell silent. Then, slowly, it was replaced by that now familiar scratching. But this time, it sounded like it was coming from directly behind the plaster, as if something was trying to claw its way out. I stumbled backwards, my heart pounding. This wasn't possible. There couldn't be anyone in the walls. There was no space, no access points. It defied all logic. But as I watched, a small crack appeared in the wall, right where the scratching was loudest. It spread slowly at first, then faster, branching out like a spider's web. I raised the bat, ready to swing at whatever emerged. The crack widened, plaster dust filling the air. And then, impossibly, a hand thrust through. It was pale, almost translucent, with long, tapered fingers that ended in sharp points. It groped blindly in the air, searching for something to grasp. I screamed and swung the bat. It connected with the hand with a sickening crunch. The hand withdrew, disappearing back into the wall. The scratching resumed, more frantic now, moving rapidly away. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back to the corner of the room, bat clutched to my chest, watching the cracked wall for any sign of movement. By morning, I was exhausted, jittery from too much coffee and fear. In the harsh light of day, I examined the wall again. The crack was still there, but it looked smaller somehow, less dramatic. Had I imagined the hand? Was I losing my mind? I spent the day researching the history of the house, looking for any clues that might explain what was happening. What I found chilled me to the bone. The house had been built in the 1920s by a reclusive architect named Edward Holloway. According to local legend, Holloway had been obsessed with the idea of creating a house that was alive. He'd incorporated strange design elements and unorthodox building materials, claiming he was imbuing the structure with a form of consciousness. Holloway had disappeared shortly after the house was completed. The official story was that he'd moved away, but rumors persisted that he'd somehow become trapped within the very walls he'd built, doomed to wander the hidden passages of his living house for eternity. I dismissed it as local folklore, the kind of ghost story every old house seems to accumulate. But as night fell and the noises began again, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was some truth to the tale. This time, I was determined to find answers. I grabbed a hammer from the garage and began tapping on the walls, listening for hollow spots. Most of the house sounded solid, but in the study, I found an area that resonated differently. Heart pounding, I began to chip away at the plaster. It came away easily, revealing a space behind that shouldn't have existed, a hidden passage, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. I shone my flashlight into the opening. The beam illuminated a narrow corridor that seemed to stretch endlessly in both directions. The walls were covered in strange symbols and diagrams, etched directly into the wood. As I stood there, trying to process what I was seeing, I heard it. Footsteps, echoing from somewhere deep within the hidden passages. They were coming closer. I scrambled back, ready to run, but something made me hesitate. The footsteps didn't sound threatening. They were halting, unsure, almost timid. "Hello," I called out, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. Then, slowly, a figure emerged from the darkness of the passage. It was an old man, his clothes tattered and outdated, his skin pale as if it hadn't seen sunlight in decades. His eyes, when they met mine, were filled with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. "Are you real?" he asked, his voice cracked and dry from disuse. I nodded, unable to form words. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. "I've been trapped for so long," he said. "The house, it's alive. It doesn't want to let me go." As if in response to his words, the walls around us began to creak and groan. The hidden passage started to close, the edges of the opening I'd made drawing together like a wound healing. Without thinking, I reached out and grabbed the old man's hand, pulling him through the rapidly shrinking hole. We fell backwards onto the study floor just as the wall sealed itself shut, leaving no trace of the opening. The old man, Holloway, I presumed, lay on the floor, gasping and staring wide-eyed at the ceiling. "It's over," he whispered. "After all these years, it's finally over." But even as he spoke, I could hear it. The scratching in the walls, louder than ever before, moving through the house, converging on our location. The house wasn't going to let him go without a fight. I helped Holloway to his feet. "We need to leave," I said. "Now." We made our way through the house, the noises following us, growing louder with each step. Picture frames rattled on the walls, floorboards buckled and warped beneath our feet. It was as if the entire structure was trying to stop us from reaching the front door, but we made it. We burst out into the cool night air, not stopping until we reached the sidewalk. Behind us, the house shuddered and groaned like a living thing in pain. As we stood there, catching our breath, I turned to Holloway. "What now?" I asked. He looked back at the house, a mixture of fear and sadness in his eyes. "Now," he said, "we make sure no one else ever gets trapped in there again." I nodded, understanding. We had work to do, but first, I needed to make a call. My parents were definitely going to need more than an exterminator for this. As we walked away, I could have sworn I heard the house whisper behind us, a sound of longing and loss. I didn't look back. Some things, once seen, can never be unseen, and some houses, once awakened, can never truly be put back to sleep. The old radio crackled to life at exactly midnight, playing a broadcast that shouldn't have been possible. That's when I realized I wasn't alone in the cabin. I'd been house-sitting for the Johnsons, a lovely elderly couple from my church, while they were on a month-long cruise. Their cabin, nestled deep in the woods about an hour outside of town, was a quaint throwback to simpler times. No Wi-Fi, spotty cell service, and appliances that looked like they belonged in a museum. But it was peaceful, and I welcomed the chance to get away from the chaos of my everyday life. The first few days passed uneventfully. I spent my time reading, taking long walks in the surrounding forest, and enjoying the solitude. The nights were the hardest, though. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of leaves in the wind. It was on the fourth night that everything changed. I'd been having trouble sleeping, tossing and turning in the unfamiliar bed. As the ancient grandfather clock in the living room chimed midnight, I decided to get up and make some tea. That's when I heard it. A soft crackling sound, coming from the direction of the living room. At first, I thought it might be the fireplace coming back to life, but I distinctly remembered banking the coals before bed. As I crept down the hallway, the sound became clearer. It was a radio. The Johnsons had an old tube radio, a massive wooden thing that took up half of the sideboard. They'd told me it hadn't worked in years, kept more for nostalgia than function. But as I entered the living room, I saw the dial glowing faintly in the darkness. Static filled the air, interspersed with bursts of music and fragments of speech. I approached cautiously, half expecting the sound to stop, to wake up and realize it was all a dream. But the radio continued its eerie broadcast. As I got closer, the static began to clear. A voice emerged, deep and resonant, with an accent I couldn't quite place. "This is a special broadcast for Sarah," the voice said, and I felt my blood run cold. Sarah. That was my name. "We've been waiting for you, Sarah. It's time to come home." I stood there, frozen, as the voice continued. It spoke of things it shouldn't know. My childhood fears, my secret dreams, the name of my first pet, things I'd never told anyone. "Who are you?" I whispered, not really expecting an answer. The radio crackled, and for a moment, I thought I saw a face in the glowing dial, gaunt, with hollow eyes and a too-wide smile. Then it was gone, replaced by more static. I reached out with a trembling hand and turned the radio off. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there in the dark, my heart pounding. trying to make sense of what had just happened. It must have been a prank, I told myself. Someone had fixed the radio and was playing a cruel joke. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The voice had known things, impossible things. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in the kitchen, jumping at every creak of the old house settling, every whisper of wind through the trees outside. When dawn finally broke, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Surely, in the light of day, last night's terror would seem silly, overblown. But as I went to make coffee, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, on the kitchen table, was a photograph I'd never seen before. It showed a young girl, maybe 8 or 9, standing in front of a house I didn't recognize. But the girl was me. I picked up the photo with shaking hands. This wasn't possible. I'd never been to this house, never worn the dress the girl in the photo was wearing. Yet there I was, smiling at the camera as if I didn't have a care in the world. I turned the photo over. On the back, in faded handwriting, was a single sentence. Sarah comes home, 1954. 1954. Decades before I was born. I dropped the photo as if it had burned me. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. I needed to get out of this house, to call someone, anyone. I ran to the front door, only to find it locked. Not just locked, sealed. It was as if the door had fused with the frame, becoming one solid piece of wood. The windows were the same, smooth panes of glass with no way to open them. Panic rising in my throat, I ran from room to room, looking for a way out. But every exit was sealed. I was trapped. As my desperation peaked, the radio crackled to life again. This time, the voice was clearer, closer somehow. "Why are you running, Sarah? Don't you want to come home? We've been waiting so long." I spun around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. But the room was empty. The voice was coming from the radio, yet it sounded as if it was right next to me,